Hello, my dear friends. Just one waltz repetition was enough to make the bride's family want to cancel the engagement. In Victorian times, love was not spoken, emotions were not expressed, and every private action was monitored by servants, future mothers-in-law, or menstrual cycles. Every gift, every smile, even the smell of perfume, could become an excuse to be banned forever. There was no room for spontaneity, only formulas and acting. Tonight, let's quietly step into the strange world of Victorian dating. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If someone today imagines Victorian dating as a private chance for two people to discover one another, the reality was entirely different. A meeting between a young man and woman of respectable class was less about romance and far more about demonstration. It was an event set up to prove that each side was suitable, not only for one another, but for the families standing behind them. In this sense, every encounter resembled an inspection. The household created the stage, the participants acted out the expected roles, and the judgment was passed quietly once the visitor left. The result was rarely based on affection. It was based on how well each candidate performed under the silent but heavy weight of social expectation. The setting was almost always domestic, a parlour arranged with polished furniture, carefully placed flowers, and a tray of tea served as the environment where these rituals unfolded. The young woman appeared dressed with purpose. Her gown was selected not by whim but by calculation. A colour too bold might look improper, while a colour too plain might seem careless. Even the way she moved into the room carried meaning. She did not walk to greet the visitor for her comfort. She walked in a way that showed her training, her discipline, and her readiness to be measured. The young man entered with similar awareness. His clothing, his gloves, his bow, and his first words were studied. Families looked for signs of arrogance, signs of poverty, or signs of frivolity. A misplaced comment or a clumsy action could easily close the door to another meeting. For him, impressing the young woman was only part of the task. More important was convincing her family that he was respectable, stable, and morally reliable. Privacy was absent. The concept of two people spending time together without oversight was considered improper. A mother or an aunt often sat nearby, pretending to pour tea while in reality observing every movement. Even siblings sometimes joined to ensure that nothing occurred beyond the approved script. In this atmosphere, natural conversation was nearly impossible. Words were filtered, glances were restrained, and emotions were buried. It almost feels like calling these encounters dates is a joke, since they had more in common with examinations at school than with moments of affection. The pressure on young women was immense. They were taught that their reputation rested on these occasions. A laugh too loud, a smile too long, or a look too direct could damage their standing. Families wanted their daughters to appear modest, gentle, and controlled. This meant that authenticity was dangerous. To be too much herself was to risk being judged as reckless. A girl might feel excitement or boredom, but she could not show either. Instead, she performed composure as though it were a second skin. Young men felt pressure of another kind. They had to present themselves as serious and prepared for marriage. Flirtation without purpose was seen as a waste of time. They were measured not only by manners but by financial stability and family reputation. A charming personality was never enough. If his income was insufficient or his background questionable, the match would likely fail. When we compare this to today, where a bad first date often just means moving on to another, in the Victorian world, a single poor impression could shape the rest of a person's marriage prospects. After the visit ended, the real work of judgment began. Families gathered quietly. A mother might comment on how the visitor held his teacup. A father might remark on how a girl's voice carried too much eagerness. Every detail was taken as evidence of character. These evaluations were not spoken in front of the young people, but they determined whether the relationship advanced or ended. What seems minor to us was decisive to them. The entire process stripped away the idea of personal choice. For young women, the expectation was to demonstrate obedience to tradition. For young men, the expectation was to show reliability for the future. Feelings of love, if they existed, were considered secondary. This is why novels of the period were filled with longing and passion. In real life, those qualities had little safe place to exist. The parlour was no home for desire, it was a room for control. Even the smallest gestures carried coded meaning. A pause before answering a question could suggest hesitation. Too much eagerness to please could be read as desperation. To succeed. One had to maintain a delicate balance that few could master with ease. I cannot help but think how exhausting it must have been to live each day knowing that even the simplest smile could be misread as a flaw. The constant presence of supervision meant that nothing escaped the eyes of others. Servants often became silent observers, reporting what they noticed to their employers. Family friends repeated impressions during afternoon teas. A young couple could not escape these networks of judgment. Their personal story never truly belonged to them. It was always filtered through layers of family opinion. The weight of these encounters was clear. Marriage in Victorian times was rarely the product of passion. It was the result of successful navigation through a maze of social rules. Those who failed to meet the standards faced difficulties in securing any match at all. A reputation damaged once was difficult to repair. Families remembered, neighbours whispered, and opportunities closed. To step into a drawing room was to step into a test. The teacups, the chairs, and the polished floors were not just decorations. They were instruments in a system designed to measure morality and suitability. Both sides knew this, and both sides behaved accordingly. The young man showed respect. The young woman performed modestly. Their families looked on and decided it was not love, but it was the accepted path to marriage. This system of judgment defined the rhythm of courtship for decades. Those who lived within it accepted its rules, just as people today accept the rules of their social environments. They did not question whether there could be another way. To them, it seemed natural. But behind the politeness and refinement lay an unspoken truth. These meetings were not about two people. They were about families seeking assurance that their honour and status would remain intact. Behind these gatherings, there was always someone watching in silence, keeping her thoughts hidden. The mother of the household held the real key, and her sudden judgment could change the entire future of the relationship. Underneath the watchful rituals of Victorian meetings, another layer of power always remained. The quiet presence of the mother was far more decisive than anything spoken between the young man and woman. She might sit calmly, appearing to serve tea or smile politely, but she was measuring every detail. Families relied on her judgment because she was believed to know how to read people best. The mother observed posture, tone of voice, and small expressions that others might ignore. In her hands rested the approval or rejection that shaped whether a connection could continue. The young couple, often nervous enough with the formalities, also carried the silent knowledge that the mother's impression could determine their future. Her authority was rooted in tradition. Fathers held legal and financial control, but mothers managed reputation and morality within the household. A daughter might be close to her father, but the final say on courtship often came from her mother's opinion. Likewise, a suitor could impress with wealth or good name, but if the mother disliked his manners, it would be difficult to move forward. This was not openly declared, yet everyone understood it. The control was subtle, but unshakable. It is almost funny that a young man could prepare for weeks to present himself well, only to be dismissed because he stirred his tea the wrong way in front of his mother. The influence of mothers stretched beyond the moment of the visit. Conversations held later in drawing rooms or over afternoon tea often centred on the impressions gathered from these encounters. Sisters, aunts, and family friends might offer their views, but it was the mother's voice that carried the most weight. Her approval acted as a green light, while her disapproval often meant an end without discussion. Daughters were expected to follow her guidance, and sons rarely went against it either. It was assumed that mothers saw what others could not, and to question her judgment risked dishonouring the family. This authority created an atmosphere of constant testing. A young woman meeting her potential future family knew that the mother of her suitor would be studying her carefully. A misstep could brand her as unsuitable, a laugh at the wrong moment, an expression of confidence that seemed too bold, or even the choice of a dress could lead to criticism. The mother did not need to confront her directly. A quiet remark later, a look exchanged with her husband, or a subtle comment during tea could be enough to close the matter. For the young woman, the risk of rejection was ever present. Modern readers may find it strange that a person's entire future could rest on such delicate observations. Compared to today, where couples often decide together whether they like each other, in the Victorian world, a third party made the crucial choice, and that third party was usually the mother. This placed enormous pressure on young women to master social codes. They rehearsed their smiles, controlled their laughter, and trained themselves in every form of politeness. What might seem natural to us was carefully drilled into them, because they knew how much depended on these performances. The mothers themselves did not always act with cruelty. Many believed they were protecting their children from unsuitable matches. They saw it as their duty to safeguard the family's reputation and stability. In a society where scandal could destroy prospects, their caution made sense to them. Still, their judgments could feel harsh. They might dismiss a girl for appearing too eager or for seeming too independent. Sometimes these opinions were based on prejudice rather than fact. But in that world, her perspective was decisive. From the suitor's side, the challenge was no less daunting. A young man trying to win favour had to court not only the woman he admired but also her mother. This meant he had to balance charm with restraint, to show respect without appearing weak. He needed to signal seriousness while avoiding arrogance. The mother's evaluation was constant, and any failure to meet her standards could cancel his efforts. I think this must have been deeply frustrating for many young people, knowing that their feelings counted for less than the impressions recorded silently by an older observer. Reports about these encounters did not vanish quickly. Families kept long memories. A single mistake could resurface later in conversations, shaping future decisions. When mothers gathered with friends for tea, they often shared impressions of potential suitors or brides. These networks spread information across households, sometimes magnifying small errors into lasting reputations. In this way, the influence of one mother could ripple outward, affecting the chances of many young people in the community. For young women hoping to marry well, impressing the mother-in-law became a goal as important as securing the interest of the man himself. They studied manners, practiced small gestures, and tried to anticipate expectations. For young men, winning the respect of the mothers was a way to prove maturity and readiness. These dynamics made the mother a gatekeeper to marriage. Even if she rarely spoke openly about her power, she was the silent judge, shaping outcomes with a nod or a frown. The result of this system was that romantic relationships were often interrupted before they could develop. A couple might feel drawn to one another, but if the mother disapproved, the connection ended swiftly. There was little space for rebellion. Families placed stability above affection, and young people were expected to comply. Those who resisted risked scandal and exclusion. The control of mothers ensured that boundaries were enforced. This dominance also reflected the wider role of women in Victorian households. While men managed property and politics, women governed morality and domestic reputation. The drawing room was their domain, and within it they exercised authority with precision. Courtship, being both moral and domestic, fell naturally into their hands. What outsiders might see as quiet influence was, in reality, a powerful control over the direction of family life. As we look back, the image of Victorian mothers becomes clear. They were not simply background figures. They were the central arbiters of who was allowed to marry into the family and who was cast aside. Their approval was not a formality. It was the deciding factor. This authority shaped countless lives, determining futures in ways that modern people might struggle to understand. And as these mothers tightened their hold on courtship, another layer of surveillance was at work too, carried out by people who seemed invisible but who could quietly destroy an entire romance. In the flow of Victorian courtship, once the mother's quiet judgment set the tone, the next stage often came through something far less personal. A small piece of paper, carefully printed and often carried in the pocket of every respectable gentleman, became the main tool for opening doors to potential relationships. This was the calling card, and in the rigid system of the time, it was far more than a polite introduction. A card left at the door was not simply a way of saying hello, it was a request to be considered, a signal of intent, and an invitation for a family to evaluate whether the man was even worth a conversation. To modern eyes, it may seem cold to treat courtship like an exchange of business cards, but for Victorians, it fit perfectly into their structured world. The calling card was simple in form but heavy in meaning. It usually displayed only a man's name and sometimes his title or address. Yet when he left it at the door of a household, he was not just offering his identity, he was asking for permission. The family of the young woman now held the power to accept or reject without ever having to confront him directly. If they were interested, they might return the gesture with a card of their own or allow him to visit. If not, they simply did nothing. Silence was enough. For the man, waiting for a reply could feel like waiting for a verdict. It is almost sarcastic to note that men called this romance, while in reality, it was more like a job application where rejection came without even a thank you letter. The silence itself carried weight. A family did not need to explain why they ignored a card. Perhaps they found the man's reputation questionable. Perhaps his income seemed insufficient. Perhaps the mother simply disliked him. Whatever the reason, he received no explanation. His card would remain unanswered, and the door would stay closed. This method avoided conflict but also stripped away any sense of mutual choice. The decision belonged firmly to the household, not the individual young woman. For young women, receiving cards was both flattering and burdensome. Some were known to collect many, sometimes dozens, in the span of a season. Each card represented a possible future, but also an obligation to respond or reject through family channels. She rarely had the freedom to answer according to her feelings. Instead, she listened to the advice of her parents, especially her mother. A card from a wealthy man with a strong reputation was taken seriously, even if she felt little personal interest. Meanwhile, a card from someone she might secretly admire could be dismissed if her family judged him unworthy. This created a peculiar imbalance. The outward appearance of courtship seemed polite and controlled, yet inside the homes, it was full of quiet negotiations and unspoken rules. For many men, the card became the only safe way to approach a woman without scandal. To speak directly was improper. To write a letter without permission risked offence. The card was neutral, formal, and acceptable. But it also drained the process of intimacy. A man's first move toward romance was reduced to placing a piece of paper on a silver tray. When compared to today, where someone might send dozens of quick messages online in minutes, the Victorian ritual of delivering a single card and waiting days or weeks for a response feels astonishingly slow and restrained. The cards themselves carried layers of social meaning. Quality of paper, style of printing, and even the manner of delivery were all noted. A poorly designed card suggested carelessness or a lack of refinement. A card delivered at the wrong time of day showed ignorance of etiquette. Some families judged a man's worth before even meeting him, simply by looking at the quality of his card. This added yet another layer of performance to an already exhausting system. Men spent effort and money ensuring that their cards communicated dignity and seriousness. In some cases, households kept the cards they received as records. Trays filled with names displayed the level of attention a daughter attracted. Visitors could glance at them and silently measure her desirability. For the young woman herself, this was a double-edged sword. A full tray meant she was admired, but it also meant she was constantly under comparison. Her popularity became a matter of family pride, but not necessarily personal joy. The practice also created social hierarchies. A man of high standing expected his card to be answered promptly. A man of lower status often knew his card would be ignored. Families treated cards from prestigious households with more respect than those from newcomers. In this way, the system reinforced class boundaries. Courtship did not open doors between groups. It tightened the locks. Some young women quietly mocked the process. They saw the pile of cards as evidence of how little their real feelings mattered, but mocking it openly was dangerous. Families expected them to treat every card as serious business. Many of these young women must have grown tired of smiling politely at stacks of names, knowing that their voices were the least important part of the decision. Even when a card was accepted, the process moved slowly. The man might be invited to call at a set time, under supervision. This did not guarantee progress. It only allowed him to demonstrate himself further. Families used the card system as a filter, ensuring that only those who passed the first test ever reached the drawing room. From there, mothers and fathers continued to judge. The calling card was not romance. It was the gate through which all romance had to pass. The irony of this custom lies in its lack of personal connection. What began as a polite social tool became the central method of courtship. Men and women who might have shared a genuine interest were forced to navigate this ritual, turning affection into bureaucracy. The card symbolized approval and rejection at once. For some, it opened doors. For others, it marked the end before anything began. Looking back, the calling card system reflects how much Victorian dating resembled a performance rather than a personal journey. Every step was coded, every gesture monitored, and every decision filtered through family authority. The young people themselves played only small roles in their own stories. Their futures depended not on feelings, but on cards, reputations, and judgments they could not control. And while families used these small pieces of paper to control access, there were other figures in the household who watched quietly, carrying tales and shaping outcomes in ways the young couple could never predict. Life inside a Victorian household did not revolve around family members. Within those same walls lived the servants, and their presence shaped courtship in ways that were often invisible but deeply powerful. They were the ones who opened doors, carried letters, and moved quietly through parlours and corridors. Their duties gave them constant access to private moments. A suitor arriving with flowers or a carefully written note did not simply meet the young woman of the house. He first passed through the eyes and ears of those employed there. Servants noticed everything. They saw how long a man lingered at the door, how nervous a young woman seemed after a visit, and how the family reacted once the guest had gone. They rarely spoke openly, but their quiet observations often travelled back to the masters in subtle ways. A glance that lingered too long, a smile held for a second more than proper, or a sudden blush could all be recorded in the mind of a servant. Later, these impressions might be whispered in the kitchen or mentioned lightly to a mistress during conversation. Families trusted their staff to report on the behaviour of guests, and this trust turned servants into silent judges of propriety. A young couple might believe they were discreet, but nothing escaped the attention of those who moved constantly through the house. It is almost amusing that the same people asked to polish the silver were also expected to polish the reputations of their employers by reporting on every slip in behaviour. Letters were perhaps the most vulnerable part of this surveillance system. Romantic correspondence had to pass through multiple hands before reaching its intended recipient. A servant often collected the post, and another delivered it upstairs. Along the way, envelopes could be opened or at least examined. Content judged too emotional or daring could be criticised before it ever reached the addressee. Sometimes letters never arrived at all. They were intercepted quietly. either to prevent scandal or to assert control. For the young people writing them, every word carried the risk of exposure. This constant inspection extended beyond the walls of the house. When young couples walked in gardens or attended social events, servants still watched. A maid accompanying her mistress, or a footman standing by a carriage, noticed every movement. Their reports later shaped family impressions. In some households, servants became trusted informants who effectively controlled whether a courtship was seen as respectable or improper. Their role was not to support romance, but to guard the family name. Modern dating relies heavily on privacy, even secrecy at times, but Victorian couples had none of this. Compared to today, where people text in private or meet without oversight, Victorians lived under a constant shadow of observation, and that shadow often came from the very staff serving the meals. The irony is that families both relied on and feared their servants. They needed their loyalty, but they also knew how much power they carried through knowledge. A disloyal servant could ruin reputations by sharing information beyond the household. Young women understood this reality clearly. They knew that every smile, every hurried note, and every small gesture might be carried back to their mothers through the words of a maid. This made genuine intimacy nearly impossible. Even if a girl wanted to show interest, she had to weigh the consequences of what the servants might say. Families expected daughters to behave modestly, and the presence of watchful staff ensured that this expectation was enforced. For the young men, the challenge was equally heavy. A clumsy remark could be repeated, and an emotional letter could be criticized before reaching its destination. The servants themselves lived in an unusual position. They were close enough to see the private emotions of their employers, yet distant enough to be treated as invisible. They passed through rooms without acknowledgement, yet their observations carried weight. Their lives were tied to the households they served, and loyalty was expected. Still, they could not escape the temptation of gossip. Sharing information, even small details, gave them influence. In a world where class barriers were so strong, information became their subtle power. From the family's perspective, this system provided security. They believed that their household staff acted as protectors of morality. By monitoring behavior, they kept daughters from scandal and ensured that suitors behaved with restraint. This sense of control comforted parents, especially mothers who feared their children might stray beyond acceptable limits. Yet this same control also suffocated genuine connection. Young people were forced to hide feelings, and even simple kindness could be twisted into gossip. It is not hard to imagine how stressful this must have been. A girl might write a letter with trembling hands, unsure whether it would be read by someone other than the man she loved. A young man might hesitate before slipping a note into an envelope, aware that his words could be judged by strangers before they reached their destination. I think this made courtship feel more like a trial than a personal choice, because every step was monitored and measured by people who were not even part of the relationship. Over time, this system of surveillance became part of the normal rhythm of life. Families expected it, and servants performed it as part of their duties. Rarely did anyone question whether it was fair to the young people themselves. Privacy was not a value Victorians held in the same way we do today. Reputation mattered more, and maintaining it justified the intrusion. For families, the price of safety was worth more than the risk of giving couples freedom. This ever-present watch shaped not only relationships, but also the very idea of love. To love in Victorian society was to love under observation. Intimacy was always filtered, always restrained, always subject to outside approval. What might have grown naturally was trimmed and shaped until it fit within the acceptable boundaries. Families depended on this system, and servants became indispensable tools for maintaining it. And as these hidden observers carried whispers from parlours to kitchens, another stage awaited where romance took on a more public form, dressed in music and movement, yet still bound tightly by rules. Even after the watchful eyes of mothers and the silent reports of servants, courtship in the Victorian world still had another stage of display. That stage was the ballroom, where music and movement turned into a carefully regulated form of social evaluation. Dances were not merely entertainment, they were ceremonies, where the pairing of partners carried meaning, and the length of each dance signalled intentions that everyone in the room could read. A ball might appear to be filled with joy, chandeliers glittering above and gowns sweeping across polished floors, yet beneath the sparkle was a rigid system of judgment. Each dance offered not freedom, but another test of suitability for marriage. The waltz became one of the most controversial dances of the time. It required closeness between partners, with hands held and bodies turned toward one another in a way earlier dances had avoided. This intimacy caused alarm among older generations, but it also made the waltz a powerful signal. To dance one waltz with someone might be acceptable. To dance more than once in the same evening, especially consecutively, suggested deep interest or even an unofficial claim. Families noticed, friends whispered, suitors who repeated the same partner too often risked gossip, while young women who agreed too readily risked their reputations. It is almost comical to think that turning in circles for a few minutes could be taken as a declaration of love. But in the Victorian ballroom, it often was. Balls were structured with programs listing the order of dances. Gentlemen could request dances in advance, and ladies recorded their partners. This meant that even before the first note of music, a pattern of interest was already visible. A young woman whose card filled quickly was seen as desirable. One with empty spaces risked embarrassment. The very piece of paper meant to organize the evening became another measure of worth. Mothers looked over these cards, noting who asked for which dances and how often. Each request became evidence in the ongoing evaluation of courtship. The ballroom itself magnified social status. Wealthy families hosted grand events in their homes, while others attended public assemblies. In both cases, the guest list was carefully controlled. Invitations were a way of signalling inclusion, and being absent from important balls could damage a family's standing. For young men and women, attendance was essential. These were the arenas where reputations were made, matches were considered, and opportunities were won or lost. Missing a season of balls could mean missing the chance for a respectable marriage altogether. Once inside, the rules were unspoken but rigid. Partners bowed and curtsied, conversations were polite, and every movement was observed. A stumble on the floor might be laughed at quietly, but it could also become a whispered mark against someone's grace. Appearance mattered as much as behaviour. A gown too bright or too plain, a suit poorly fitted, or jewellery considered excessive all could feed gossip. Nothing escaped notice in a room filled with people who treated dancing as another form of surveillance. Modern readers may see dancing as light-hearted recreation, but in Victorian society, it carried weight far beyond the moment. Compared to today, when couples might dance casually in nightclubs or weddings without consequence, Victorians lived in a world where every step across the floor could shape their future. It was not simply about enjoying music. It was about signalling availability, interest, and respectability all at once. Young men faced their challenges. They had to balance attention between multiple partners. Favouring one too much could create rumours, while spreading themselves too thin could look insincere. They were expected to know the etiquette of each dance, to guide their partners smoothly, and to display confidence without arrogance. Success on the dance floor was not only physical but social. A skilled dancer who navigated etiquette well gained admiration. A poor dancer risked mockery and suspicion. Young women, meanwhile, experienced both opportunity and constraint. A full dance card gave them the appearance of popularity, but they still had to be careful. Accepting too many dances from the same man raised questions. Refusing too many offers could be seen as prideful. They learned to manage their cards strategically, balancing between politeness and caution. The act of writing down names became a delicate negotiation, with mothers often glancing over shoulders to monitor choices. Beyond the individual dances, The atmosphere of the ballroom encouraged subtle performances of affection. A glance exchanged during a pause, a few words spoken between turns, or a smile shared at the right moment could all hint at growing interest. But these gestures never remained private. Dozens of eyes caught them, and rumours spread quickly. Servants at the edges, family friends in corners, and rivals seated along the walls all noticed. The ballroom was a public stage, and every step on its floor was part of the play. Some young people did manage to enjoy themselves, finding ways to laugh quietly or savour moments of closeness. But even those moments were overshadowed by the awareness of being judged. I believe that many must have felt the weight of constant performance, knowing that what looked like joy on the outside was really another test in disguise. The music provided rhythm, but the real tempo was set by the expectations of society. This system also reinforced class boundaries. Not everyone could afford the clothing, the lessons, or the invitations required to participate fully in the dance culture. Those who lacked these resources were often excluded. For those who did attend, the display of wealth through attire and elegance through movement confirmed their place in the social order. Dance, far from being an escape, became a reinforcement of the very hierarchies that defined Victorian life. Evenings ended with more evaluation. Families remembered who danced with whom, who repeated partners, and who appeared too eager. These impressions carried forward into discussions about possible matches. A young man who danced too much with one woman might be considered serious about her, even if he had not intended such a message. A young woman who allows the same partner repeatedly might be judged as careless with her reputation. Nothing was innocent. Everything was interpreted. Looking back, the ballroom shows clearly how Victorian courtship transformed ordinary activities into coded rituals of selection. To dance was not only to move with the music, but to step into a system of judgment. Each waltz was a signal, each turn of the floor a declaration. While novels and films often romanticize these scenes, the reality was far more calculated. Beneath the chandeliers, people were not simply dancing, they were competing, performing, and negotiating futures. And when the music faded and the couples left the floor, another stage awaited. This time in the quiet drawing rooms where courtship looked less like joy and more like a rehearsed performance under candlelight. Behind the polished shine of the ballroom, courtship often continued in far smaller but no less controlled spaces. These were the private drawing rooms of the home, where meetings between young men and women were arranged in a setting designed less for intimacy and more for scrutiny. The atmosphere felt like a stage. Candles glowed not for romance but for display. A tea tray sat on the table, not to comfort guests but to provide one more opportunity to measure manners. Every chair was placed deliberately. Every clock was watched carefully. Guests knew from the moment they stepped into the room that their behaviour was being weighed. The parlour was not a refuge. It was a theatre of morality. The arrangement of the room mattered. Families took care in deciding who sat where. The daughter of the household often took a central place, visible but surrounded by relatives or trusted companions. The suitor might sit across from her, but never too close. The space between them was intentional, a physical reminder of restraint. To lean forward or reach out would be a violation. Around them, parents, siblings, or aunts positioned themselves in ways that created both a witness stand and an audience. The young people did not simply meet each other, they performed under observation. Every gesture became part of the performance. Pouring tea had to be done gracefully, with steady hands and polite words. Sitting too casually in a chair could suggest disrespect. A glance that lingered too long might raise suspicions. Silence risked being interpreted as dullness. Talking too much risked being seen as arrogant. What might feel like ordinary human variation became evidence in the ongoing evaluation of character. It is almost sarcastic to say that these were dates at all, since they resembled examinations in manners more than chances for people to know one another. Lighting added to the atmosphere. Candles or oil lamps created a soft glow, but this was not designed for warmth. It highlighted faces and made expressions clear to anyone watching. Shadows could not hide discomfort or hesitation. In this light, even small shifts of expression could be noticed. Families valued this exposure, believing it allowed them to read a person's true nature. For the participants, it was one more reminder that nothing they did escaped attention. Timing was also part of the ritual. Visits were scheduled with care, and the length of time spent together was monitored closely. Staying too long could be seen as presumptuous. Leaving too early might appear dismissive. The balance was delicate, and the clock in the corner was as much a participant as anyone else in the room. Departure times were expected to be respected to the minute. A young man who overstayed risked being remembered for his lack of restraint rather than his charm. Even conversation was tightly managed. Topics considered too personal were avoided. Instead, the discussion focused on safe subjects like literature, music, or current events. Yet even in this, caution ruled. Expressing an opinion too strongly might brand someone as improper. Families looked for moderation, not passion. A calm tone, polite phrasing, and deference to elders were essential. These standards reduced the possibility of a real connection, but they satisfied the need for appearances. Compared to modern dating, where conversations often aim to reveal personalities and feelings, Victorian parlour meetings were about hiding one's true self beneath layers of controlled politeness. Young women carried perhaps the greatest burden. Their families expected them to be graceful, modest, and quietly attentive. Any mistake reflected poorly on their virtue. A laugh too loud or a question too bold might be remembered as flaws. They were taught to sit with perfect posture, to answer calmly, and to never let impatience show. The visit was not theirs to enjoy, it was theirs to survive with dignity and tact. For young men, the burden was to show respect, seriousness, and reliability. A careless joke or a hint of impropriety could end the possibility of a match. This system reinforced the idea that courtship was not private but communal. Families participated actively in shaping outcomes. The drawing room visit was less about love and more about negotiation. Two households measured one another, deciding whether they could accept a future alliance. The young couple's role was small. They were expected to perform properly and leave decisions to their elders. Mishaps could be costly. A teacup spilled on a dress, a misplaced word, or a nervous silence could all be judged as signs of carelessness. Families remembered such incidents and repeated them in later conversations. What might have been forgotten in another context became a permanent mark. This heightened the anxiety of the young people, who knew that even an accident could shape their future. For many, the drawing room created a sense of suffocation, to sit surrounded by watchful eyes, speaking carefully chosen words, and leaving at the appointed time left little room for natural affection. It was not about discovery, but about discipline. A young woman who hoped to show kindness or curiosity had to restrain herself. A young man who wished to express admiration had to bury it in politeness. What emerged was a hollow interaction, judged valuable not for emotion but for control. I think these moments must have felt draining because they demanded constant performance without offering any space for honesty. The private stage of the parlour was, in reality, not private at all. Servants passed through, parents listened, and siblings observed. Even if a couple wanted to exchange a genuine look or word, they risked being seen. Nothing remained between them alone. What they carried from these meetings was not memory of connection, but awareness of scrutiny. Yet families continued to value this ritual. They saw it as protection against scandal and proof of moral integrity. A household that controlled its drawing room visits demonstrated discipline to society. A young couple that performed correctly gained approval. The ritual may have strangled affection, but it upheld reputation. For Victorians, reputation mattered more than love. This constant supervision and ritualized behavior reveal much about how the society viewed human interaction. They feared disorder and so they staged even the smallest meetings as performances of order. Love might bloom later, if at all, but propriety had to come first. The drawing room made sure of that, and while these staged visits gave the illusion of control, the secret exchange of written words still tempted many couples, offering hope for real intimacy even under the risk of discovery. After the parlour visits ended and the formality of the ballroom faded, many young Victorians still longed for some form of privacy. The only way to create that privacy, however fragile, was through the written word. Letters became the secret lifeline of many romances, passed quietly from one hand to another, slipped into envelopes, and sealed with hope. On the surface, the act of writing a letter looked harmless. In reality, it was one of the riskiest steps a young man or woman could take. The rules surrounding love letters were strict, and the consequences for breaking them could be severe. For men, the task was to write with care, balancing affection with restraint. A letter filled with too much passion could easily be judged as improper. Language that hints at physical desire or unrestrained emotion might brand the writer as reckless. On the other hand, a letter too cold or distant could signal a lack of sincerity. The balance was delicate. Many chose to write with formality, focusing on admiration, respect, and the promise of devotion rather than uncontrolled feeling. It is almost ironic that letters meant to express love often ended up sounding like official petitions, stripped of the very emotion they were meant to carry. For women, the act of receiving or sending letters was equally dangerous. A letter discovered by the wrong person could spark a scandal. Families expected their daughters to protect their reputations at all costs. Accepting a man's letter without parental approval was sometimes seen as betrayal. Writing back without permission was even worse. The smallest slip could brand a woman as improper, and that mark could follow her for years. Some families even punished daughters for hiding letters, seeing it as evidence of secrecy and disobedience. Letters rarely travelled privately. Servants often handled them, and many were read before reaching the intended recipient. A maid might open an envelope, or a mother might inspect the contents. Families believed it was their right to monitor correspondence. They wanted to ensure that nothing scandalous passed between their children and outsiders. This practice destroyed the very secrecy the letters were meant to create. Young people wrote with the constant awareness that others might read their words. They censored themselves, turning what could have been an outlet for intimacy into another exercise in restraint. Still, the temptation to write was strong. Letters allowed couples to express thoughts impossible to say in person under watchful eyes. Even with the risk, many chose to write anyway, hiding their notes in books, handing them through trusted friends, or even slipping them directly into the hands when no one was looking. The danger itself added to the intensity. Knowing that a single discovery could end everything made the words feel heavier, more urgent. But this urgency did not mean freedom. It meant fear. Modern readers might wonder why letters were treated with such suspicion. Compared to today, when text messages and emails flow constantly and privately between couples, Victorian love letters were fragile objects, always at risk of interception and always under suspicion of impropriety. This difference highlights how much society valued control over intimacy. Privacy was seen as a threat, and so even written words had to pass through barriers of supervision. Some letters that survived reveal the effort writers made to avoid scandal. They often contained long passages about morality, duty, and faithfulness, mixed with cautious expressions of admiration. Rarely did they include direct statements of desire. Instead, feelings were buried beneath layers of careful phrasing. A man might write of respect for a woman's virtues rather than his longing for her presence. A woman might express gratitude for a man's attentions rather than confessing her feelings. These strategies protected them, but they also dulled the honesty of what they wrote. The families, of course, justified their interference as protection. They argued that young people could be misled, that men might deceive daughters with false promises, or that women might become too emotional and risk their virtue. By monitoring letters, they believed they were shielding their children from harm. Yet this protection often became suffocation. Genuine affection was treated as a problem to be managed. Scandals erupted when letters were discovered in the wrong context. A single note hidden in a drawer could be read by a parent and taken as evidence of disobedience. If the correspondence was considered improper, the relationship could be ended immediately. In some cases, young women were forbidden to see certain men again, their families locking them away from further contact. For men, exposure could ruin reputations, branding them as dishonorable or untrustworthy. The risk was so great that many destroyed letters after reading them, fearing what might happen if they were found later. For those who managed to keep letters hidden, the experience could be bittersweet. On one hand, the written words allowed them to feel closer, to believe that their feelings were real and shared. On the other hand, the constant threat of exposure turned every message into a gamble. I think it must have been both thrilling and exhausting to cling to secret notes that could either bring joy or destroy reputations in an instant. Despite the dangers, letters continued to circulate. They offered the only chance for private communication in a world that allowed almost none. The handwriting itself became a form of intimacy. Holding a page that a loved one had touched, seeing the ink they had chosen, and reading words written just for them gave a sense of closeness unmatched by the formalities of parlours or ballrooms. It was a fragile closeness, always under threat, but it was better than nothing. Some couples managed to carry on long correspondence, slipping letters through trusted friends or sympathetic servants. Others failed quickly when families intercepted the first exchange. The outcome depended less on the couple's feelings and more on the network of control surrounding them. Privacy was never guaranteed. Every envelope was a risk, every word a test of caution. Looking back, love letters reveal both the desire for intimacy and the heavy restraints of Victorian society. They show how young people tried to carve out spaces of honesty within a culture that demanded silence. The very existence of these letters proves that affection could not be erased entirely, no matter how hard families tried to control it. Yet the risk attached to them also shows how fragile affection was under such a system. And while some lovers poured their hearts into paper under candlelight, others turned to silent signals hidden in fans, gloves, or pins, hoping to communicate without a single word being read. After the fragile words of letters passed through too many hands, couples often searched for other ways to speak without speaking. This was where the silent language of objects emerged, a code written in fans, gloves, and hairpins. In the strict formality of Victorian society, every gesture could carry meaning, and young people took advantage of this. They created small signals that looked harmless to outsiders, but whispered messages to those who knew how to read them. A fan lifted to the face, a glove dropped at the right moment, or a pin placed deliberately to one side of the hair, all became tools of quiet communication. These were the secret phrases of a world that forbade open honesty. The fan was perhaps the most powerful symbol. Women carried them constantly, especially at balls and social gatherings. A fan moved in one way might signal boredom, in another way curiosity, and in yet another a hint of affection. Touching it to the forehead could mean nervous excitement, a message to the man watching that she liked him but felt shy. Closing it sharply might signal annoyance. Families saw only a woman cooling herself, but those paying attention read the signs. This system of meaning gave young women a rare chance to express what they were not allowed to say aloud. It is almost humorous to realize that something as simple as holding a fan became riskier than speaking plainly, because the wrong movement could start rumors as quickly as any overheard word. Gloves also carried meaning. They were essential parts of dress, symbols of refinement and modesty. But a glove could be used as a message. Dropping one near a suitor might be a request for him to come closer, an invitation that no chaperone could accuse of impropriety. To pick up the glove and return it was to acknowledge the signal. To ignore it was to let the moment pass. For people living under such restrictions, this small act became a spark of connection. What looked like a clumsy accident was in fact deliberate, a carefully chosen gesture that might be remembered long after the evening ended. Hairpins and accessories added to this secret language. A woman might fix her pins slightly off to one side, not because it was practical, but because it sent a message. To those who understood, it hinted at the wish for private conversation, or at least a moment of closer attention. These signals were small enough to be dismissed if questioned, yet meaningful enough to guide behavior. Couples built entire exchanges out of such gestures, weaving conversations of interest through objects rather than words. Modern readers may see this as excessive, even absurd, compared to today, when people can speak freely, message instantly, and express themselves openly. The Victorian reliance on silent gestures shows how tightly their world was bound by fear of impropriety. The very need to invent a hidden code proves how much emotion was forced underground. Affection was not absent, but it had to survive in disguise. This secret code did not always protect young people. Misinterpretation was common. A man might believe a signal meant interest when it was nothing more than chance. A woman might use the gesture carelessly, not realizing how others might interpret it. Families sometimes suspected these codes, and watchful mothers paid close attention to accessories and movements. Servants, too, noticed and reported what they saw. Even the secret language was never truly safe. Yet despite the risks, it spread widely. Manuals of etiquette even listed potential meanings of fan movements or glove gestures, half condemning and half acknowledging their use. This made the code both public and private. Everyone knew about it, yet it continued because couples needed it. Without such signals, they would have been left only with stifled conversation and censored letters. With them, they at least had the hope of creating a connection in a controlled world. For women, this language was empowering in its limited way. It gave them a method to express desire, caution, or curiosity within boundaries that silenced them otherwise. For men, it offered hints of encouragement or warning without words. The shared understanding of these signals built intimacy precisely because it was forbidden. To read a glance or a gesture correctly created a bond that felt secret, even if it was surrounded by watchful eyes. Still, the system reinforced how little freedom truly existed. Every signal had to be hidden within respectability. Every message risked discovery. Couples lived in a world where honesty was dangerous, so they built their honesty out of objects. But objects could betray them as easily as words. A fan dropped too often, a glove misplaced too boldly, or a pin adjusted too obviously could expose their intentions and spark gossip. I find it striking that people invested so much meaning into such tiny details, because it shows both their creativity and their lack of freedom. In an environment where everything was supervised, they carved out these small cracks where emotion could slip through. Yet the cracks were narrow, and the risk of being caught was always near. The codes also reveal the deep tension between desire and restraint. People wanted to show affection, but they could not. They wanted to be honest, but honesty could ruin them. So they lived in a half-world where gestures carried the weight of feelings too dangerous to name. To dance was to declare, to write was to risk, and to move a fan was to whisper in silence. This was Victorian romance, built not on freedom but on signals hidden in plain sight. And as these signals flickered in crowded rooms and silent parlours, the larger truth remained that love itself often never had the chance to grow, cut off before it could begin by the walls of class and family authority. Love in the Victorian world was fragile even before it had a chance to take root. The rules of family, class, and reputation weighed so heavily that many affections were ended almost as soon as they began. If a relationship crossed the boundaries of social class or ignored the expectations of family, it rarely survived. Families treated love not as a private feeling, but as a public danger when it threatened the carefully built structure of respectability. What began as a glance, a letter, or a whispered signal could be discovered and extinguished before it grew into anything lasting. In this society, the force that destroyed young romances was not a lack of feeling, but too much control from the outside. The most common obstacle was class. A young woman of higher standing who showed interest in someone beneath her rank faced swift consequences. Families feared that marrying below their station would damage their reputation, dilute their status, and invite whispers from society. The punishment often came quickly. Daughters were sent away under the excuse of rest or recuperation. These retreats, sometimes to country houses or the homes of distant relatives, were meant to separate her from the man she cared for. The message was clear. Love that crossed social lines had no place in a respectable household. It is almost bitterly humorous that what was called a restful holiday was, in reality, exile disguised as medicine. For young men, the outcome was often different but no less restrictive. A man who pursued a woman considered beneath his station risked being forced into an engagement with someone else. Families acted to redirect his attention toward women judged as worthy partners. This was not simply about personal preference. It was about securing alliances between households, preserving wealth, and maintaining influence. The heart of the young man mattered little compared to these priorities. He could be pressured, persuaded, or even threatened until he accepted a match that satisfied his family. These separations happened quietly, but their impact was severe. Young people learned that affection was powerless against the machinery of social expectation. A girl who cried over a forbidden romance might be told she was being dramatic. A boy who resisted might be lectured about duty. Neither had space to argue. Their futures were not theirs to decide. Families made sure of that. The methods of control varied. Sometimes it was direct removal, sending a daughter away to distant relatives. Other times, it was constant surveillance, ensuring that meetings never occurred again. Letters could be intercepted. Friends who tried to help could be warned or punished. Gossip spread quickly, and families feared scandal more than their children's unhappiness. A young woman labelled reckless for her feelings could find her prospects ruined. A young man branded disobedient might face damage to his career or inheritance. Modern readers might expect rebellion, but the cost was often too high. Compared to today, where couples might resist family disapproval and marry for love, Victorian couples lived in a system where disobedience meant losing social standing, financial support, and sometimes the possibility of marriage altogether. Love was not only discouraged, it was actively punished when it threatened the order. This constant suppression shaped how young people thought about relationships. Many accepted early that love was unreliable, that it could not be trusted as a guide for life. They learned instead to value duty and arrangement. Passion was left for novels and poems, while reality demanded caution. Those who dared to hope for more often discovered the limits of their society the moment they reached beyond their assigned circle. Some examples from the period show how strict these boundaries were. When a young woman of wealth fell in love with a tutor or a clerk, her family might remove her from the household entirely. The tutor could be dismissed, his reputation ruined. The girl might be sent to relatives in the countryside, expected to forget. In some cases, her letters were destroyed and her belongings searched for signs of attachment. Families treated her feelings as though they were an illness to be cured. The young man, meanwhile, might be pressured into leaving town or taking employment elsewhere. What looked like a private romance became a public problem. For those who experienced such losses, the memory often lingered. Some young women never married afterward, their reputations stained by the hint of scandal. Others were forced into marriages they did not want, living lives shaped by obedience rather than affection. Young men, too, carried the marks of broken romances. They might fulfill family duty, but they rarely forget the relationships cut short. In letters and diaries, traces of these suppressed loves survive, showing both the strength of feeling and the cruelty of its denial. The larger consequence was a culture where love itself was distrusted. Families taught their children that passion led to danger. They insisted that real security came from arrangement, not emotion. This lesson echoed in drawing rooms, in conversations over tea, and in the way people whispered about those who had broken the rules. To feel too much was to risk too much. The safe path was to submit. For some, these lessons created resignation. They married who they were told, lived as expected, and buried their personal desires. For others, the suppression created quiet rebellion, though rarely in ways strong enough to overturn family power. Some couples managed to meet in secret, clinging to their affections despite the risk. But such stories were rare, and their endings often tragic. Families usually won because society supported their authority. I think the saddest part is how many young people never even had the chance to test their feelings, because those feelings were cut off before they could grow. Love became something imagined rather than lived, an idea talked about more in fiction than in life. The system left little room for choice, and so romance withered under the weight of duty. This cycle repeated across households. Parents acted with the belief that they were protecting stability, while children learned that their hearts were not their own. Society reinforced this pattern with gossip, judgment, and exclusion. The result was a culture where love was rarely free, and where most people expected their futures to be arranged rather than chosen. And while families crushed these early sparks of romance, another measure of control waited, turning purity itself into a currency for marriage and binding women to standards they could never escape. Among all the unspoken rules that governed Victorian courtship, none was more heavily enforced than the demand for a woman's virginity before marriage. This expectation was not only a matter of morality, but also a form of social currency. In a culture that prized appearances above truth, a young woman's worth in the marriage market was measured in large part by whether she could present herself as untouched. Losing virginity before the wedding meant more than personal shame. It could erase her from the possibilities of upper society, closing doors to respectable households and leaving her future damaged beyond repair. The strictness of this rule explains why families invested so much effort into supervision. Every parlour meeting, every ball, and every walk in the garden was guarded to ensure that young women remained above suspicion. Reputation had to be protected at all costs. Even rumours of impropriety could be enough to harm a girl's prospects. Families feared not just scandal, but the loss of the family's standing in society. Marriage was not a private matter. It was a transaction between households, and purity was part of the price. It is almost sarcastic to say that young women were treated like investments, because that was exactly how many families thought of them. To enforce these standards, families sometimes took extraordinary measures. Investigations could be carried out quietly, with friends, servants, or acquaintances asked to report on a girl's behaviour. Mothers and fathers listened closely to gossip, weighing whether their daughter's reputation had suffered even the slightest blemish. In some cases, families even hired discreet individuals to verify what they called indirect proof of a woman's virtue. This did not mean medical examination in the sense we know today, but rather observation of behaviour, questioning of servants, or review of social interactions. The process was humiliating in its implication, reducing a young woman's life to a constant test she could never escape. The pressure created fear. Young women lived with the knowledge that one mistake, one misinterpreted gesture, could brand them forever. Even those who were innocent might suffer from whispers. A smile held too long, a letter discovered in a drawer, or the simple misfortune of being alone with a man for too many minutes could be enough to spark rumours. Once the rumours began, they were difficult to erase. Society preferred to assume guilt rather than innocence, and families were often left scrambling to repair the damage. When damage could not be erased, marriages were sometimes rushed. A wedding arranged quickly after a scandal was seen as a way to cover what had happened. If a young woman was suspected of having lost her virtue, families sought to tie her to the man involved before the whispers spread too far. These marriages were less about love than about crisis management. Compared to today, Where a relationship might survive a mistake or a misunderstanding, Victorian society responded to the same situation with near panic, forcing marriages not out of choice but out of fear. The consequences of failing to repair such a scandal were severe. A woman who lost her virginity outside marriage and did not marry quickly afterward was often excluded from polite society. Invitations disappeared, friends distanced themselves, and families withdrew their support. Her future became one of quiet isolation or, at best, marriage into a much lower circle. Her own household might treat her as a burden rather than a daughter. In the harshest cases, women were sent away, hidden from view so that the family name could survive without her. This double standard was striking. Men were rarely judged by the same measure. A man's reputation could survive impropriety, sometimes even gaining from whispers of experience. For women, the same whispers destroyed. The imbalance left them trapped, forced to guard themselves constantly while watching men escape consequence. Yet this unfairness was accepted as normal. Society built its order on it, and families enforced it without hesitation. The pressure to maintain purity shaped how women lived. They were taught from childhood to avoid even the appearance of impropriety. They were told to be modest in dress, careful in speech, and restrained in manner. Affection had to be hidden, curiosity suppressed, and feelings buried. Virginity was not simply physical. It was treated as a state of being, visible in posture and demeanor. Families expected their daughters to embody purity not only in fact but in performance. This performance was exhausting. Young women grew up knowing that their value was conditional, that it depended on something they could lose through no fault of their own. An assault, a rumor, or even a false accusation could erase years of careful behavior. I think it must have been terrifying to live with the knowledge that so much of one's life could be destroyed by circumstances beyond control. To survive in such a world required constant vigilance, not only of oneself but of everyone around. Some households went further, arranging their daughters' marriages as soon as possible, believing that marrying young reduced the risk of scandal. This approach did not remove the pressure, it simply passed it on to the marriage itself. A woman who married quickly was still judged afterward, her role shifting from protecting her virginity to protecting her reputation as a faithful wife. The cycle of surveillance never ended. The cultural obsession with purity left its mark on stories and records of the time. Novels of the Victorian era often carried plots where women were ruined by impropriety, sometimes through their own choices, often through circumstances they could not control. These stories reflected real fears. Society did not forgive. A man might recover from scandal, but a woman rarely did. Readers understood this, and the novels reinforced the lessons. Purity preserved the future, impurity destroyed it. Families acted ruthlessly in defense of this rule because they knew the stakes. A daughter's scandal damaged more than her future. It damaged the marriage prospects of siblings, the reputation of parents, and the standing of the entire household. This collective consequence explains why control was so tight. It was not only the young woman's burden, it was the family's survival. The constant surveillance and pressure reveal much about Victorian values. Love was not the measure of marriage. Purity was. To enter a marriage with a clean record was to secure the approval of society. To enter without it was to risk being cast out. In such a system, feelings mattered little. What mattered was control, appearance, and the preservation of order. And as purity became currency, emotions themselves were pushed aside, forcing couples to bury their true feelings and perform a life where sincerity was hidden beneath endless layers of manners. The weight of purity as social currency pressed heavily on every young person, but it did not exist in isolation. It shaped the very way Victorians expressed themselves in daily life. Affection, longing, and passion were not simply discouraged, they were forbidden. A glance that lingered too long, a smile at the wrong moment, or a touch that strayed beyond a formal greeting could all spark judgment. The culture of restraint turned human emotion into something dangerous, something that had to be locked away behind discipline. In polite society, sincerity had no place unless it wore the mask of manners. Love was not absent. It existed quietly, hidden under layers of self-control. A young woman might look across the room at the man she cared for, but she had to drop her eyes quickly before anyone noticed. A young man might long to hold a hand or whisper affection, but even the thought of such behavior in public was unthinkable. The rules insisted that emotions remained inside, invisible to the community. What people saw was performance. What they did not see was the truth, carefully suppressed in the name of respectability. It is almost sarcastic to say that Victorians were experts at acting, because they lived their whole lives on a stage where feelings were the forbidden script. The smallest details were policed. Eye contact had to be brief and polite. Too long a gaze suggested impropriety. Smiling was acceptable, but only faintly and at the right moment. A smile that appeared too warm might be read as flirtation. Laughter was limited, controlled so that it did not sound unrestrained. Touching was nearly impossible. Even brushing hands could be criticized as reckless. Families expected these boundaries to be followed strictly, and those who broke them risked scandal. This discipline did not only apply to courtship, it extended into social gatherings of all kinds. At dinners, in parlours, and during visits, young people were watched closely. They learned to present calm, polite versions of themselves, never revealing too much. Over time, this constant control shaped their personalities. They became skilled at self-censorship, at hiding what they felt. Affection, anger, disappointment, all had to be managed carefully. The true person was hidden behind a polished surface. Modern people might find such restraint difficult to imagine. Compared to today, when couples often show affection openly in public, Victorian men and women had to behave as though attraction itself was shameful. Holding hands on the street would have been shocking. Writing openly about desire in a letter could have ended a courtship. Even speaking too warmly about another person in front of family might have caused suspicion. The boundaries were so strict that many relationships struggled to find space for genuine intimacy. The cost of this suppression was heavy. Young couples rarely had the chance to know one another honestly before marriage. What they saw was a performance, and what they showed was a mask. Only after the wedding, when the rules loosened slightly, could they reveal more of themselves. Even then, reputation still mattered. Married couples had to behave in ways that satisfied social expectations. For many, the result was a life where emotions remained half-hidden, even in private. For women, the burden was especially strong. They were taught from childhood that virtue meant silence and restraint. To express too much was to risk ruin. They had to embody modesty not only in clothing but in demeanour. They practiced calm smiles in mirrors, trained themselves to lower their eyes, and avoided speaking boldly. Their future depended on it. For men, the rules were also limiting, though less harsh. They had to show control, seriousness, and respectability. A man who appeared too affectionate was mocked as foolish. A man who appeared too bold was judged as dishonourable. The balance was narrow, and many walked it with difficulty. The irony is that while emotions were hidden, everyone knew they existed. Parents, siblings, and friends all understood that young people felt affection. But instead of allowing expression, they built barriers against it. They treated emotions as forces to be controlled rather than truths to be respected. The system valued order more than honesty, reputation more than sincerity. Some people adapted, learning to navigate these restrictions with skill. They used coded signals, careful words, and controlled gestures to hint at their feelings without breaking rules. Others suffered quietly, their affections crushed by silence. A young woman who longed to speak openly might never find the chance. A young man who wanted to show admiration might only express it through restrained politeness. For both, The experience was one of constant frustration. I think many must have lived with the feeling of being trapped in their skins, unable to let the world see what they truly felt. The broader society reinforced this culture through literature and conversation. Novels often presented passionate feelings as dangerous, leading to downfall or tragedy. Plays and moral tales warned against indulgence in desire. Parents repeated these lessons at home, reminding children of the cost of impropriety. The message was consistent: real emotion was a threat, and only discipline preserved the family name. This attitude also shaped the idea of marriage. Courtship was not about falling in love, it was about proving worth through restraint. A couple might reach the altar with only a faint knowledge of one another's true character. Love, if it appeared, was expected to grow later within the boundaries of marriage. To modern eyes, this seems backward, but to Victorians it was the safest path. Emotion could not be trusted. Only control could. The culture of suppression did not erase all passion. Instead, it forced it underground. Lovers found ways to express themselves in letters, in signals, or in rare moments of privacy. But these were exceptions, not the rule. For most, affection lived quietly in their hearts, never fully shared. The risk was simply too great. Families demanded silence, and society rewarded it. The legacy of this restraint can be seen in the way Victorians are remembered: stern, serious, and proper. Behind those images, though, were real people struggling with feelings they could not show. Their lives were shaped by the constant tension between what they felt and what they were allowed to display. That tension created frustration, but it also defined the culture of the age, and as emotions were hidden behind careful smiles and lowered eyes, even the simple act of exchanging gifts became another test, where meaning had to be coded and mistakes could carry consequences. After the restraint of emotions and the careful silence of gestures, another stage of Victorian courtship emerged in the giving of gifts. On the surface, a present might appear to be a simple act of kindness, but in reality, it was loaded with meaning and risk. In a society where everything was coded and observed, gifts became tests of judgment, revealing not only the feelings of the giver, but also their knowledge of etiquette, their understanding of boundaries, and their sense of social position. To give the wrong object was not a small mistake. It could damage a reputation, or even end a courtship. Each exchange became less a symbol of affection, and more a delicate performance of social knowledge. Flowers were the most common, but also the most dangerous of gifts. Each bloom carried a coded meaning, and Victorians treated these meanings seriously. A red rose was considered too bold unless an engagement had already been announced. To offer one too early was seen as a declaration of passion, almost indecent in its directness. Other flowers carried gentler associations. White lilies suggested purity, violets humility, and forget-me-nots quiet loyalty. A man had to choose carefully, making sure that his selection communicated respect without stepping beyond what was acceptable. It is almost laughable to think that a bouquet could cause scandal, but in the Victorian drawing room, even petals carried the weight of judgment. Books, paintings, or small souvenirs were seen as safer gifts, yet even these carried risks. The book had to be appropriate in subject. A volume of poetry might be considered too romantic if offered too early, while a book on history or science appeared suitably restrained. Paintings or engravings had to be tasteful, never suggesting immodesty. Souvenirs from travels could be charming, but they had to strike the right balance between thoughtfulness and modest expense. A gift too cheap could suggest carelessness or a lack of respect. A gift too costly could be read as bribery, an attempt to purchase affection. The balance was delicate, and few managed it perfectly. Young women, too, participated in this ritual. They were expected to receive gifts with grace, but also to avoid seeming too eager. To accept too many items from one man might raise suspicion. To reject them too quickly might be seen as rude. Their role was to navigate the fine line between gratitude and modesty. Families often monitored these exchanges, reminding daughters that every object could be interpreted as evidence of character. The entire ritual shows how little freedom existed in Victorian courtship. Even in something as personal as giving or receiving a gift, the expectations of society dictate behaviour. The drawing room became a place where objects were examined almost as closely as people. A present was not judged only for what it was, but for what it implied. Families whispered about the meaning of gifts, debating whether they were suitable, modest, or scandalous. Compared to today, where people exchange gifts casually on birthdays or holidays without fear of ruining their reputations, the Victorian obsession with coded meaning feels suffocating. These customs also reinforced class boundaries. Wealthy men could afford elaborate books, fine jewellery, or imported flowers, signalling their status along with their affection. Men of lesser means had fewer options, and their gifts sometimes exposed their lower position. This created inequalities that no amount of sincerity could overcome. Families read gifts as evidence not only of feeling but of financial capability. A man who could not afford appropriate presents might find himself dismissed as unsuitable, regardless of his virtues. For the giver, the pressure was immense. He had to consider the stage of the relationship, the preferences of the woman, the opinions of her family, and the standards of etiquette, all while choosing something that expressed his interest. For the receiver, the pressure was just as heavy. She had to interpret the meaning correctly, respond with measured gratitude, and avoid any appearance of impropriety. What should have been moments of joy became moments of calculation. Sometimes the stakes became painfully clear. A man who gave flowers considered too bold might find his visit suddenly declined. A woman who accepted jewellery too eagerly might be whispered about as greedy or reckless. Gossip spread quickly, and even small missteps became public knowledge. The safest path was often the dullest, leading many to choose neutral gifts that carried little risk. Yet this safety also drained the gesture of meaning, leaving both sides unsatisfied. The ritual of gift-giving also revealed the gap between public expectation and private feeling. A man might long to give something personal, a token that truly expressed his affection, but he often held back, fearing the consequences. A woman might treasure such an object, but she, too, feared discovery. Instead, they exchanged what was safe, living with the disappointment that sincerity had no place in their world. I think this must have been frustrating for both sides, because gifts that should have been filled with meaning became reduced to symbols of caution. Still, some couples managed to create hidden significance in their exchanges. A book of poetry might be chosen not only for its content but for a particular line inside it. A flower might be included quietly within a larger bouquet, carrying a message only the two understood. These secret layers allowed couples to reclaim some intimacy, even within the constraints of etiquette. Yet even these gestures carried risk. Discovery could lead to scandal, and the consequences were often severe. Looking back, the Victorian approach to gifts reveals how completely their society transformed romance into ritual. Objects that today bring joy were treated as potential threats. Affection had to be disguised within rules, and sincerity had to be hidden beneath restraint. The drawing room, once again, became a stage. Every book, every flower, every trinket was a prop in the performance of morality. In this world, even happiness was dangerous. To give too much, to accept too openly, to enjoy too freely, all were risks. The lesson repeated itself in every exchange. Appearances mattered more than truth. For Victorians, love was not simply about emotion. It was about surviving the endless tests of reputation. And while gifts carried layers of judgment, even clothing itself became part of the message, turning fabric and colour into signals that shaped how courtship was understood. Clothing in Victorian society was never just fabric and decoration. It was a language in itself, carrying meanings that could define a woman's reputation and determine how others treated her. For young people in courtship, dress became another form of communication, a silent but powerful statement about readiness, restraint, or respectability, every choice of fabric, colour, and style was watched closely. Families, friends, and strangers alike judged what they saw, interpreting clothing as evidence of morality. In a world where feelings were hidden and words censored, appearance took on the burden of expression. What someone wore could encourage attention, discourage it, or destroy a reputation entirely. Light-lace dresses were often chosen by young women who were entering the age of courtship. These gowns, delicate and bright, signalled openness to meeting suitors. They carried an air of innocence while still being fashionable, a balance that families approved. Wearing such a dress to a ball or gathering suggested that a girl was ready to be seen and considered, but still modest enough to fit the standards of propriety. The lace itself added to the impression of purity, softening her image and making her appear approachable within the rigid boundaries of etiquette. It is almost sarcastic to say that a piece of fabric could decide a future, but in the Victorian world, a dress was more persuasive than a spoken word. By contrast, darker clothing carried heavy meaning. Purple dresses, in particular, indicated mourning. A young woman in purple was effectively announcing that she was not open to courtship. Families respected these signals, and suitors avoided approaching. The colour acted as a shield, protecting her from unwanted attention and preventing rumours about impropriety. It showed that she followed custom, honouring the loss of a relative by stepping back from social opportunities. This choice of dress revealed how clothing could set strict boundaries, deciding whether a young woman was available to meet suitors or closed off to them. Necklines became another area of constant scrutiny. A collar cut too low could invite damaging whispers, even if the intention was nothing more than following a fashion trend. Society often judged harshly. A young woman wearing a revealing dress risked being labelled as reckless or immoral, regardless of her behaviour. Families feared such gossip, knowing it could harm not only the girl's chances of marriage, but also the reputation of the entire household. As a result, daughters were often reminded to dress conservatively, to avoid colours or styles that might suggest boldness. What might have been personal preference became a test of character. Accessories also carried weight. Gloves, hats, and jewellery were expected to match the occasion, neither too extravagant nor too plain. A woman who dressed too richly might be accused of vanity or trying to attract attention. A woman who dressed too simply might be seen as careless or poor in taste. The balance was delicate, and the wrong choice could cause quiet but lasting damage. Men, too, were judged by their clothing, though less harshly. A well-tailored suit demonstrated respectability, while carelessness in dress suggested irresponsibility. The standards for men were easier, but they still existed, reinforcing the idea that clothing was a moral statement for everyone. The cost of clothing added another layer to the ritual. Wealthier families could afford dresses made of fine fabrics, imported lace, and carefully tailored designs. Poorer families struggled to keep up, sometimes reusing or altering older gowns to maintain appearances. Society judged not only style but also quality, reading clothing as evidence of financial stability. This created inequality in courtship, where women from less wealthy households faced disadvantages before even speaking a word. Their dresses spoke for them, and what they said was often judged as inadequate, compared to today, where people can dress casually and still form relationships freely. The Victorian fixation on dress as moral evidence seems exhausting and unfair. The rituals of dress were taught early. Young girls were instructed on how to present themselves, how to choose appropriate colours, and how to avoid anything that might cause gossip. Mothers and aunts reminded them constantly that the world watched every detail. They were told that clothing could protect or ruin them, that modesty was safety, and that fashion was dangerous if taken too far. These lessons shaped how young women thought of themselves. They learned to measure worth not only by their behaviour, but also by the fabric they wore. The social control hidden in these rules left little room for individuality. To dress differently was to risk exclusion. Those who tried to express personal taste often paid the price in whispers and judgment. The system valued conformity above creativity, demanding that everyone look respectable according to the same standard. For many women, clothing became a prison rather than an expression of self. Their choices were limited not by their desires, but by the fear of how others would interpret them. At the same time, clothing offered one of the few socially acceptable ways to signal interest. A carefully chosen colour, a slightly different accessory, or a deliberate change of style could send a quiet message. Men and women learned to read these signals just as they read gestures with fans or gloves. To wear a certain shade of ribbon might mean openness to attention. To remove a piece of jewellery could be a subtle rejection. These codes allowed some freedom, but only in secret, layered beneath the heavy expectations of propriety. The emphasis on dress also reflected the wider values of Victorian society. Appearances mattered more than feelings. A woman who looked respectable was assumed to be respectable, regardless of her private life. A woman who looked bold was judged harshly, no matter her true character. Clothing became a tool of social control, reinforcing the idea that morality was not about truth, but about presentation. Families cared less about what their daughters felt than about how they appeared to the world. I think the saddest part is that many young women must have felt invisible as individuals, reduced to dresses and accessories that others judged as symbols rather than expressions of who they were. Their personalities, desires, and feelings were hidden beneath lace and fabric, erased by the demands of propriety. They learned to accept this, but the loss of freedom was real. Looking back, the Victorian approach to dress shows how deeply society mistrusted honesty. Clothing was not only decoration but a script, guiding behaviour and shaping destiny. What someone wore could mark them as pure, reckless, available, or untouchable. In this world, fabric carried more weight than words, and lace decided futures more than love did. And while clothing turned into a silent language of judgment, even the faintest scent of perfume could spark suspicion, turning fragrance itself into another battlefield of respectability. The control of appearance in Victorian society did not stop at clothing. Even scent became a subject of judgment. Perfume, which today is often used to express individuality or attraction, was treated in that era as a moral signal. A fragrance could elevate a young woman's reputation or destroy it, depending on how it was chosen and how strong it was. Families, friends, and even strangers in a ballroom paid attention not just to how a woman looked, but to how she smelled. This invisible detail carried weight equal to lace, fabric, or jewellery. In a culture obsessed with surface respectability, even a trace of fragrance became a kind of weapon. Powerful but dangerous. Strong perfumes were viewed with suspicion. A scent that lingered too heavily in the air was thought to suggest boldness or impropriety. Women who wore such fragrances were sometimes accused of trying to attract attention in ways considered indecent. Families whispered about them, labeling them as lacking modesty. Men might find the scent appealing, but society treated it as a sign of recklessness. The unspoken rule was clear. Respectable women had to avoid anything too noticeable. Subtlety was safety, while intensity was ruin. It is almost sarcastic to think that a drop too much of perfume could brand a woman as immoral, but that was exactly how people judged in the Victorian age. Imported perfumes carried an even heavier stigma. Foreign scents, often stronger and richer than local ones, were rumoured to belong to women of questionable reputation. Stories spread that certain fragrances were linked to actresses, courtesans, or women who lived outside the bounds of respectability. A respectable young woman caught wearing such a scent risked being grouped with them, even if she had chosen the perfume innocently. Society rarely gave her the benefit of the doubt. The result was caution. Families discouraged their daughters from using imported fragrances, pushing them instead toward lighter, plainer scents that carried no risk of scandal. Herbal perfumes became the accepted standard. Lavender, rosewater, and other mild botanical scents were seen as appropriate for a proper lady. These fragrances were light enough to be noticed only up close, suggesting modesty rather than boldness. They gave the impression of cleanliness and refinement without calling attention. Wearing such scents reassured families and suitors alike that a young woman followed the rules of propriety. It was not about personal preference, but about social expectation. The goal was to present oneself as pure and disciplined, never indulgent or excessive. This obsession with perfume reveals the depth of control in Victorian courtship. Nothing was too small to escape judgment. Clothing, gestures, gifts, and now even scent were turned into symbols of morality. Women in particular carried the burden of this scrutiny. Their bodies became surfaces onto which society projected values of purity, modesty, and discipline. Even the choice of fragrance, something invisible and personal, became public property. Compared to today, where perfume is often seen as a matter of taste and style, the Victorian tendency to treat scent as evidence of morality shows how suffocating their culture could be. The rules surrounding perfume also reinforced inequality. Men could use stronger colognes without facing the same level of criticism. A masculine scent was rarely interpreted as reckless. At worst, it was dismissed as poor taste. For women, the standards were harsher. A fragrance considered too strong was enough to damage a reputation permanently. This double standard reflected the larger imbalance of the period, where women carried the heavier responsibility for preserving the appearance of virtue. The economic side of perfume added another layer. Imported fragrances were expensive, and their association with scandal made them doubly dangerous. Yet their cost also attracted attention. A woman who wore them risked being judged as not only immoral, but also wasteful or vain. By contrast, the light herbal perfumes approved by society were affordable and modest, fitting comfortably within the image of disciplined femininity. Families encouraged their daughters to use these, reinforcing the message that moderation was a virtue. Some women, of course, tried to bend the rules. A hint of stronger perfume, applied carefully, might be used to send a quiet signal of confidence or attraction. Lovers sometimes associated particular scents with each other, creating private meanings that society ignored. But these gestures were risky. If noticed by the wrong person, they could lead to gossip, disapproval, or even the end of a courtship. As with letters or gifts, perfume became another fragile path for expressing feelings in a world that forbade honesty. The consequences of mistakes were real. A woman who smelled too strongly of perfume at a ball might find herself the subject of whispers the next morning. Families might refuse further visits from her suitor, believing she lacked modesty. A single evening of fragrance could undo months of careful restraint. This constant pressure forced women to calculate not only what they wore but also how they smelled, adding yet another burden to an already suffocating system. The culture of scent shows clearly how the Victorians confused appearance with character. They treated fragrance as proof of virtue or vice, ignoring the reality that it was nothing more than personal choice. A light herbal perfume was read as innocence. A richer scent was read as corruption. No room existed for nuance. Society preferred simple judgments, even if they were unfair. I think it must have been exhausting to live with the knowledge that even the air around you could be judged, that something as private as perfume could become a public verdict on your worth. For women especially, the pressure to manage every detail of their presentation must have felt relentless. They were not free to express preference, experiment, or indulge. Every choice risked becoming evidence against them. Looking back, the rules around perfume reveal not just social control but also fear. Society feared desire, feared attraction, and feared disorder. Strong perfume was dangerous because it suggested indulgence, and indulgence threatened the appearance of restraint. To protect the system, every sense, sight, touch, even smell, was brought under surveillance. Love could not be free in such an environment. It had to pass through endless barriers of control, each one narrowing the space for genuine connection. In the end, perfume became another symbol of how little freedom Victorians allowed themselves. Fragrance, which should have been a pleasure, was transformed into a test. Women learned to choose carefully, to remain modest, to avoid risk. Men learned to judge as society demanded, and everyone played their roles in a performance where even scent was scripted. And while perfume carried its dangers, the illusion of privacy during outdoor walks proved just as deceptive, because no couple was ever truly alone under the rules of Victorian courtship. Walks in the Victorian era might sound like opportunities for couples to enjoy time together, but in reality, they were another controlled stage of courtship. Young men and women did not simply leave the house hand in hand, free to explore gardens or lanes. Every step was watched, every pause measured, and every moment regulated. A walk was less a chance for romance than a ritual of observation, where the appearance of propriety mattered more than the feeling of closeness. Couples were granted this activity not for privacy, but as a test to see whether they could behave within the strict rules that defined society. The most striking limitation was the presence of a chaperone. Rarely, if ever, did a man and woman walk alone. Someone always followed, whether it was a younger sister, an aunt, or a trusted family friend. The task of the chaperone was clear. They were there to make sure nothing improper happened. This meant not only preventing physical intimacy, but also guarding against glances, words, or gestures that might be read as excessive. The walk was framed as an innocent exercise or fresh air, but in practice, it became another space where behaviour was monitored. It is almost sarcastic to say that couples enjoyed freedom on these walks, because the truth is that freedom was the one thing they never had. The time allowed for such walks was also controlled. Families did not permit long absences. A walk had to fit into the schedule of the day, usually lasting only as long as it took to stroll through a park or along a public street. Lingering was discouraged. If a couple tried to extend the time, it raised suspicion. The purpose was not to provide them with closeness, but to allow a brief, supervised interaction. As a result, most walks ended quickly, leaving couples frustrated rather than fulfilled. Stopping in secluded spots was especially forbidden. Couples were expected to remain visible, to stay on paths where others could see them, sitting on a bench in a shaded corner, pausing near a quiet riverbank, or wandering into a grove of trees. All these behaviours were considered dangerous. Even if nothing improper occurred, the appearance of impropriety was enough to cause scandal. Families repeated this lesson constantly. Respectability was not about what happened in truth, but about what could be seen or imagined by others. The constant risk of misinterpretation created tension. A glance that lingered too long, a smile that seemed too intimate, or a step that moved too close could lead to trouble. Rumours spread quickly, and a young woman's reputation could be ruined over the smallest suspicion. For men, the consequences were less severe but still real. Families judged them as reckless or dishonourable if they encouraged behaviour that looked improper. This meant that even during walks, couples often spoke politely and distantly, unable to express what they felt. The irony was that these walks were supposed to encourage connection. Families allowed them because they provided a safe setting for interaction, but by surrounding them with so many restrictions, the walks often prevented genuine intimacy from developing. Couples could exchange pleasantries, but little more. Their words were shaped by the presence of the chaperone, their gestures limited by the fear of judgment. What might have been an opportunity for honesty became instead another performance of restraint. Modern readers may find this difficult to imagine. Compared to today, when couples often walk freely, hold hands, and speak openly without fear of gossip, the Victorian walk seems less like a date and more like a rehearsal under supervision. It shows again how heavily the culture of that era valued appearance over truth. What mattered was not whether the couple cared for each other, but whether they behaved in ways that satisfied society's narrow definition of propriety. Chaperones themselves played a complex role. Some were strict, watching every detail, quick to report any hint of impropriety. Others were more sympathetic, offering couples a little more space within the limits. But even the most lenient could not ignore the basic duty of supervision. Their very presence was a reminder that romance was not a private matter. It belonged to families, to society, and the endless rules of etiquette. For young women, these walks could be particularly frustrating. They were judged more harshly than men, and even a momentary mistake could affect their reputation permanently. A misread glance or gesture might lead their family to forbid further meetings. Young men faced pressure as well, but they often had other options. Women had fewer chances, and so they learned to be cautious. They kept their eyes lowered, their words polite, and their steps measured. To enjoy the walk too freely was to risk losing it altogether. This system reflected the broader values of Victorian society. Romance was never about the couple alone. It was about the families, the reputation, and the maintenance of social order. A walk might have looked like a private moment, but in truth, it was a public statement. Every passerby could observe, every relative could comment, and every chaperone could report. The couple's feelings mattered least of all. Despite these restrictions, couples sometimes found ways to carve out small moments of sincerity. A word spoken softly, a glance exchanged quickly, or a gesture disguised as an accident could carry meaning. These fragments of connection were treasured precisely because they were rare. A dropped handkerchief, a shared look, or a laugh that slipped past restraint could linger in memory long after the walk ended. Such moments reminded couples that beneath the rules, real feelings still existed, but the risks were always present. Families had no patience for scandal. If a walk ended with suspicion, the consequences were swift. Visits might be restricted, letters stopped, and meetings forbidden. In extreme cases, a girl might be sent away to relatives under the pretense of rest, severing the connection entirely. The man might be pressured into pursuing someone else, someone more suitable. A single misstep on a walk could close the door to an entire relationship. I think these rules must have left many people feeling powerless, because even in something as simple as walking together, they were denied the chance to be themselves. Instead of enjoying time with each other, they lived in fear of judgment. Instead of forming natural bonds, they performed roles. Their lives were shaped by an endless series of small restrictions, each one designed to protect reputation at the expense of truth. In the end, Victorian walks reveal the same lesson as every other part of their courtship system. Love was not free, it was controlled, supervised, and shaped by fear of scandal. Even the most ordinary activity became a test of discipline, reminding couples that their hearts were never their own. And as couples tried to smile through these restrictions, they faced yet another challenge, because even the act of smiling itself had to be practiced and timed with care. After the restrictions on walks and the constant presence of chaperones, it might seem that at least small gestures of expression were left untouched. Yet even something as natural as a smile was not free in Victorian society. Laughter, joy, and warmth were all viewed through the lens of propriety. To smile too broadly was to risk appearing uncontrolled. To laugh too loudly was to risk appearing vulgar. The rules surrounding this most human of gestures reveal how deeply control penetrated daily life. A smile, instead of reflecting emotion, became a performance carefully shaped to fit the expectations of society. Young women were taught that their smiles had to be modest and restrained. A broad grin was unacceptable. It suggested exposure of inner feelings, something that polite society considered dangerous. A faint, controlled smile was the standard, signalling grace and self-discipline. Families trained daughters to practice this expression in private, standing before mirrors and learning to shape their faces into the correct version of happiness. A smile was no longer a response to joy. It was a tool of social performance. It is almost sarcastic to think that happiness itself had to be rehearsed. But in the Victorian world, even emotion needed etiquette. Laughter was even more restricted. To laugh freely, with sound and abandon, was judged as crude. Women, especially, were expected to keep their voices soft, their expressions gentle, and their amusement under control. Men were allowed slightly more freedom, but even they risked appearing unrefined if their laughter was too loud. The rules demanded that gatherings remain calm and dignified. Emotion had to be contained, never spilling into behavior that could embarrass a family. These expectations created an atmosphere where sincerity was dangerous. People smiled not when they felt joy, but when it was appropriate. A smile at the right moment showed that one understood the rules of society. It communicated discipline, modesty, and refinement. A smile at the wrong moment, however, could lead to whispers. If a young woman smiled too often at a particular man, it suggested improper affection. If she smiled too warmly during a serious conversation, it suggested frivolity. Each smile carried risk, and so each one had to be calculated. This calculation extended into every part of social life. At balls, in parlours, and during family visits, women monitored their expressions constantly. They knew they were being watched, not only by potential suitors but by mothers, aunts, and chaperones. Their smiles became another test of character. A faint smile at a compliment showed modesty. A quiet smile at a joke showed grace. Anything stronger was discouraged. This left many young women feeling that even their joy had to be disguised. Men, too, faced expectations. They were expected to maintain seriousness, smiling only occasionally to show respect or charm. Excessive laughter was seen as careless, a lack of self-control. A man who smiled too much was judged as foolish. A man who smiled too little was judged as cold. The balance was narrow, and failing to achieve it could harm his prospects. Compared to today, when people smile naturally in photos, on the street, or even in casual conversations without fear of judgment, the Victorian demand for rehearsed expressions feels almost absurd. The control of smiles also reflected broader fears about passion and desire. A smile could be interpreted as encouragement. For this reason, women were warned not to smile too often at men they were not formally engaged to. A smile was not simply a gesture, it was a signal. Families watched carefully, interpreting each expression as evidence of preference. A woman who smiled at too many men risked appearing untrustworthy. A woman who smiled too rarely risked appearing cold or arrogant. The rules created a trap where no expression was entirely safe. The burden of this system fell most heavily on women. They were told to embody modesty, to display grace without passion, to appear approachable without appearing bold. Practicing smiles in the mirror was not vanity but survival. A woman who failed to manage her expressions correctly might lose opportunities for marriage. Her reputation could be shaped by something as small as a moment of laughter. The cost of this pressure was the loss of authenticity. People lived with faces that did not match their feelings. They smiled when it was expected, not when they were happy. They suppressed laughter when they wanted to release it. Over time, this created distance between inner life and outer performance. Emotions became private secrets, hidden away to protect reputation. Relationships were shaped by appearances rather than truth. I think it must have been tiring to live in a world where even joy had to be disguised, where the smallest expression of happiness could be treated as a risk. The obsession with smiles shows how Victorian society transformed human interaction into constant theatre. Each gesture was scripted, each expression rehearsed. A smile was no longer an act of connection, it was a symbol of discipline. Families valued it as proof that a daughter had been properly trained. Suitors read it as evidence of modesty. Society as a whole used it to separate the respectable from the reckless. The result was a culture where even happiness was filtered through the demands of propriety. This control also revealed the imbalance of power. Women were judged more harshly than men, forced to spend hours perfecting their appearance. They carried the burden of representing family honour, and their smiles were seen as part of that duty. Men faced rules as well, but they were not expected to rehearse their expressions in front of mirrors. The responsibility for perfection fell mostly on women, reinforcing the larger inequalities of the era. Looking back, these rules about smiling may seem small compared to the larger restrictions on Victorian courtship, but they reveal the same pattern. Nothing was left to chance. Every detail of behaviour was shaped to protect reputation. The natural became unnatural. The personal became public. A smile, which should have been free, was turned into a symbol of control. In the end, Victorian smiles remind us that courtship was never about love or emotion. It was about discipline, reputation, and the endless effort to appear respectable. People lived behind expressions that were not their own, hiding their feelings in order to satisfy the expectations of others. The result was a society where joy itself became suspicious, and laughter was a danger to be avoided. And as the rules around expressions tightened, the words of love themselves became even rarer, because open declarations of affection were reserved not for real life, but for the pages of novels. In the rigid framework of Victorian society, the idea of a direct love confession belonged more to fiction than to daily life. The novels of the time were filled with grand declarations, passionate words, and scenes where emotions spilled into speech. But in reality, couples did not speak in such ways. A young man rarely said "I love you" to the woman he hoped to marry. A young woman did not respond with equal passion. Instead, words of affection were filtered through layers of restraint, often carried by others or left unspoken entirely. Courtship was a system of silence, where feelings were expected to exist without being expressed. Most conversations between potential couples were formal and distant. Families arranged opportunities for them to meet, but direct communication was limited. When a man wished to express interest, he often did so through the mother of the young woman or another guardian. This practice made the courtship less about the couple themselves and more about the agreement of families. A proposal might come in the form of a conversation between parents long before the young woman heard anything from the man himself. Even when feelings existed, they were communicated indirectly. It is almost sarcastic to say that romance was alive in this system when, in truth, the only people speaking freely were the parents and guardians. Words of affection were treated as dangerous. A direct declaration risked scandal, as it suggested intimacy before the proper stage. Society insisted that feelings should remain unspoken until families had approved the match. Even then, the language was cautious. A man might say that he wished to honour a woman or that he admired her qualities, but he avoided words that revealed passion. Passion was seen as reckless, unrestrained, and inappropriate for polite society. What novels celebrated, reality suppressed. Even during engagements, love remained implied rather than declared. Couples were expected to grow close, but not to reveal too much. Affection was shown in careful gestures, polite words, and family-approved interactions. The phrase "I love you" was almost absent, replaced with vague references to duty, admiration, or devotion. The assumption was that love would be understood without being spoken. Directness was seen as unnecessary, even vulgar. This silence shaped how couples related to each other. Instead of building intimacy through conversation, they relied on subtle cues. A glance across the room, a carefully chosen gift, or a faint smile became the tools of communication. Feelings were hinted at, not declared. The pressure to avoid open expression left many relationships shallow, based more on family approval than personal connection. Modern readers often struggle to understand this restraint. Compared to today, when people openly express love in texts, calls, or public gestures, the Victorian refusal to speak the words aloud feels like living in a world where intimacy was forbidden. The distance between literature and life was striking. Novels offered readers a taste of passion they rarely encountered in their own lives. Fiction became an escape, a place where characters could say what real people never dared. For women, this silence was especially limiting. They were discouraged from speaking of love even to close friends. To confess feelings was to risk appearing forward or unrestrained. Their role was to wait, to receive, and to interpret, but never to declare. Men carried more responsibility for proposals, but they too faced limits. A man who spoke too directly was seen as improper. He risked rejection not because his feelings were unwelcome, but because his words broke the rules of restraint. The absence of verbal affection also affected marriage itself. Many couples began married life without ever having spoken openly of love. Their union was based on duty, family approval, and shared social expectations. Some did grow close over time, developing affection within the safety of marriage, but others remained distant, lacking the foundation of honest conversation. Their lives together were shaped by silence as much as by companionship. Letters sometimes offered a slightly more open space. Written words could hint at affection, though they too had to be cautious. A letter filled with passion risked interception or scandal. Families often read correspondence, and servants sometimes carried messages. As a result, even private writing was rarely safe. Only in rare cases did lovers manage to exchange words of genuine feeling. For most, the letters remained polite, restrained, and carefully worded. This culture of silence reflected the larger Victorian fear of passion. Strong emotions were seen as dangerous, threatening the stability of families and communities. By suppressing direct expressions of love, society believed it was protecting order, but the cost was high. Couples were denied the chance to know each other honestly before marriage. They were expected to build relationships on implication, duty, and restraint rather than on shared emotion. I think many must have felt frustrated, knowing the words in their hearts, but never allowed to speak them. The contrast between novels and reality was striking. Readers consumed stories filled with passionate declarations, finding in fiction what they lacked in life. Writers understood this need, creating characters who spoke the words their audience could not. The popularity of such novels shows how deeply people longed for open expression, even as society forbade it. Literature became a substitute for lived experience, a place where emotions could exist without consequence. Yet even within these restrictions, people found ways to communicate. Coded gestures, subtle signals, and quiet moments allowed for fragments of honesty. A hand resting too long on another's, a word spoken softly, or a glance that lingered longer than etiquette allowed. These became the real confessions. They carried risk, but they also carried truth. In a world that silenced words, actions spoke in whispers. Looking back, the absence of verbal love in Victorian courtship shows how thoroughly society controlled intimacy. Words that should have been natural were turned into taboos. Couples were denied the chance to speak their feelings, forced instead to perform roles. Families valued silence as proof of propriety, ignoring the human cost. The result was a culture where novels contained more passion than marriages, and where reality was quieter than fiction. In the end, Victorian love confessions existed more in imagination than in life. The stage was filled with politeness, the script with restraint, and the actors with silence. Real affection was buried under layers of propriety, never allowed to appear in words. What was celebrated in books was hidden in reality, reminding us once again that love in this age was not about honesty but about discipline. And as words remained unsaid, the marriages that followed showed another truth, that people were expected to learn to love only after they had already been bound together. Marriage in Victorian society was not built on love in the way many people expect today. For families of the middle and upper classes, marriage was first and foremost a practical arrangement. It connected families, secured wealth, and preserved social standing. Romantic affection was not a requirement, and in many cases, it was treated as something suspicious. Love before marriage was often dismissed as reckless or foolish, a sign of poor judgment rather than sincerity. The prevailing belief was that affection would follow once the match had been made, but it was not to be the foundation on which the decision rested. For many young women, this reality was taught from an early age. They were reminded that their duty was not to follow their feelings, but to secure a stable future. A good match meant financial security, respect in society, and approval from family. A bad match could damage not only their prospects, but also the reputation of everyone connected to them. As a result, love was often set aside. Courtship became less about emotion and more about negotiation. The man's wealth, career, and family name mattered more than his character or his ability to inspire affection. For men, the expectations were slightly different but still rooted in duty. They were told to marry women who fit the standards of respectability, women who could manage households, raise children, and represent the family with modesty. Choosing a wife based solely on feelings was considered immature. A man who married for love risked being judged as careless, particularly if the woman brought no wealth or status to the union. It is almost sarcastic to say that love was considered a weakness, but in Victorian eyes, that was often the truth. This way of thinking meant that many couples entered marriage with little knowledge of each other's deeper selves. They might have shared polite conversations, exchanged carefully chosen gifts, and been observed on supervised walks, but these rituals rarely revealed true compatibility. Once married, they were expected to build affection over time. The hope was that respect, duty, and shared life would lead to love eventually. If it did not, the marriage still remained intact, because divorce was considered scandalous and nearly impossible to pursue. For some couples, affection did grow, shared responsibilities, children, and daily routines could create closeness. But for many others, the lack of initial choice left relationships cold. Men sometimes sought warmth outside of marriage, in affairs or discreet relationships. Women, bound by stricter expectations, often suffered in silence. The absence of love did not dissolve the marriage, but it did leave individuals living lives of quiet disappointment. To Victorian society, this was not a failure. Marriage was never meant to be about personal fulfillment. It was about stability, order, and the preservation of values. Passion was seen as unstable, capable of leading people into unsuitable unions. Love was treated as something that could exist within marriage, but not as something strong enough to guide people into it. Compared to today, where people often refuse to marry without love, the Victorian system seems cold, built more on contracts than on connection. This approach also reinforced class divisions. Families looked not for affection but for alliances. A wealthy man might be encouraged to marry the daughter of another wealthy household, even if he felt no attachment. A young woman might be pressured into accepting a proposal from someone she hardly knew, simply because his position was secure. Those who resisted faced criticism, sometimes even punishment. Individual desire mattered little against the weight of social expectation. For women, the consequences were especially heavy. Once married, they had few legal rights and little freedom. If love did not grow, they had no way to leave. Many endured lives where affection was absent, but duty kept them tied. Men at least had more opportunities to seek fulfillment elsewhere, though this too carried the risk of scandal. Women, by contrast, were expected to accept their situation without complaint. This dynamic produced a strange contradiction. Novels of the time often celebrated passionate love, filling pages with declarations and dramatic scenes. Readers consumed these stories eagerly, perhaps because they provided what real life denied them. Fiction offered a world where love could drive decisions, where people married for feeling rather than duty. But in daily life, such choices were discouraged. Literature became a dream, while reality remained bound by restraint. There were exceptions. Some couples did marry for love, though often against the wishes of their families. These unions were risky. They might bring happiness to the individuals, but damage their standing in society. Families might cut off support, gossip might spread, and opportunities might be lost. Choosing love over duty was treated as rebellion. For most, the cost was too high. They accepted the rules, hoping affection would grow later. I think many people must have felt trapped, living lives where the person beside them was a partner by arrangement rather than by choice. Some endured it quietly, convincing themselves that stability was worth the sacrifice. Others may have carried regret, wishing for the kind of romance they read about in novels but never experienced. Either way, the expectation remained the same. Love was not the foundation of marriage. It was, at best, a possible outcome of it. Looking back, this approach to marriage reveals once again how Victorian society valued order over emotion. By removing love from the decision, families believed they were protecting their children from mistakes, but in doing so, they denied them the chance to build relationships rooted in honesty and feeling. The result was a culture where many lived together without true intimacy, bound more by obligation than affection, and as children grew up watching these restrained marriages, they too were trained from a young age, learning not how to love freely but how to play the role of the perfect husband or wife. From early childhood, Victorian girls were trained not to become individuals with their own voices, but to grow into the role of the perfect wife. The lessons began at home, long before any thought of courtship or marriage. Mothers, aunts, and governesses repeated the same instructions day after day. A girl was taught how to sit properly, how to lower her eyes at the right time, and how to greet politely without appearing too forward. Every movement of her body was considered a sign of her future value. She was raised to be quiet, obedient, and graceful, not for her own sake, but for the man she would eventually marry. The idea of the ideal wife was not flexible. It was defined by society and enforced by families. A good wife was expected to be patient, gentle, and endlessly forgiving. She was not supposed to argue, complain, or express too much emotion. Her role was to create harmony in the household, even if she herself was unhappy. From childhood, girls were reminded that self-control was the highest virtue. To cry openly, to show frustration, or to resist authority was seen as weakness. A girl who learned endurance was praised, while one who resisted was scolded until she conformed. It is almost sarcastic to say that girls were raised to be themselves when, in truth, they were raised to erase themselves. Training extended to speech. A young girl was corrected if she spoke too loudly, too quickly, or too confidently. She was told to speak softly, to pause before answering, and to let others take the lead in conversation. Cleverness was not encouraged. Wit could be seen as arrogance, and strong opinions as unfeminine. Instead, she was guided to offer polite remarks, to smile gently, and to respond in ways that reassured others of her modesty. Language was not her own, but a tool to demonstrate obedience. Physical appearance was also tied to training. Girls were taught how to walk with small, careful steps, how to fold their hands neatly, and how to keep their posture straight. They were told never to slouch, never to fidget, and never to appear restless. Even their laughter was corrected. Loud laughter was scolded as vulgar, while a light, restrained smile was praised. They grew up learning that their bodies were not theirs to relax in, but instruments to be shaped for social display. This training created women who were outwardly calm but inwardly suppressed. They learned to hide frustration, sadness, or even joy if it appeared excessive. To endure quietly was seen as strength. Families repeated the lesson that a wife who suffered in silence was admirable, while one who voiced her pain was shameful. The culture valued endurance over honesty, silence over truth. Girls were prepared not for lives of partnership, but for lives of submission. Modern readers may find this difficult to accept. Compared to today, when many parents encourage daughters to be independent and assertive, the Victorian method of preparing girls to play act as perfect wives feels closer to rehearsal for a role than preparation for real life. They were actors in a performance designed to please husbands and families, not participants in relationships built on equality. The emphasis on self-denial meant that emotions became private burdens. A woman who felt anger toward her husband was expected to hide it. A woman who longed for freedom had to keep it secret. Even affection, if expressed too openly, was discouraged. The wife was supposed to remain calm, restrained, and proper at all times. The result was a culture where women became skilled in pretending. They wore masks of politeness, hiding their inner selves in order to fit the expectations placed on them. Education reinforced this training. While boys were taught subjects that prepared them for work and leadership, girls were often given lessons in domestic skills. They learned sewing, embroidery, music, and other arts considered suitable for women. These subjects were not meant to expand their minds, but to make them more appealing as wives. Music was valued not as art, but as entertainment for guests. Sewing was valued not as creativity, but as proof of domestic diligence. Even education became part of the performance. Social gatherings provided opportunities to practice these lessons. Young girls observed their mothers and older sisters, learning how to behave in company. They watched how women poured tea, how they sat during conversation, how they smiled at compliments without appearing eager. Mistakes were corrected quickly, sometimes harshly. A girl who spoke too much or laughed too loudly might be reminded in private that she risked her future. By the time she reached marrying age, she was expected to embody all the qualities of restraint, obedience, and grace. This system left little room for individuality. Girls who resisted risked isolation. Families feared that a daughter who spoke too freely or behaved too boldly would struggle to find a husband. Pressure was constant, and rebellion was rarely tolerated. Those who could not or would not conform were often judged harshly, their futures uncertain. Most chose to comply, hiding their real feelings in order to survive. I think the saddest part is that many women must have felt love was something they had to earn by performance, as if only by playing the role of the perfect wife could they be worthy of affection. Their worth was tied not to who they were, but to how well they followed the script. Love was conditional, dependent on silence and obedience. In such a system, genuine intimacy was difficult to achieve. Looking back, this training shows how deeply Victorian society distrusted emotion. By teaching girls to suppress themselves, it was believed that it was preserving order, but in reality, it created generations of women who lived behind masks. Their husbands often saw only the performance, not the person beneath. Marriages were shaped by discipline rather than connection, by endurance rather than openness. The idea of the ideal wife became a cage, passed down from one generation to the next. Girls were prepared not for partnership but for sacrifice. They grew up knowing that their role was to support, to endure, and to hide. Some may have found comfort in fulfilling expectations, but many must have carried silent regret. The culture told them that to be loved, they had to stop being themselves. And when marriages collapsed despite all this training, the consequences spilled into public view, because the cancellation of an engagement or a broken promise could ignite conflict between entire families. Behind the polished curtains of Victorian drawing rooms, the world of engagements was far from secure. While families carefully arranged matches and celebrated betrothals with pride, the reality was that engagements could collapse. A broken engagement was not a private matter but a public event, one that sent ripples through families, social circles, and entire communities. It was not simply two people parting ways. It was a rupture that carried heavy consequences for honour, reputation, and the fragile balance between families. In many ways, the act of cancelling an engagement was treated with the same gravity as political betrayal, because it threatened the trust that kept the social order intact. When an engagement ended, the fallout was rarely equal. The woman nearly always bore the heavier burden. Her name became the subject of whispers, her character questioned, even though she was not at fault. A man might recover easily, finding another match within months, but for a woman, the stain lingered. Families worried that others would hesitate to propose, fearing some hidden flaw. In truth, the flaw might be nothing more than circumstance or disagreement, but gossip was ruthless. It is almost sarcastic to think that in a society obsessed with propriety, the woman's honour could be destroyed by someone else's decision, yet that was often exactly what happened. Families treated engagements as contracts, even when they were not formal legal agreements. To break one was to insult the other family, suggesting unreliability or even deceit. The offended side might withdraw from social contact, spreading their anger in subtle ways. Invitations to events could be withheld. Alliances between households could weaken. In some cases, families used influence to deliberately damage reputations, making sure the other party suffered lasting consequences. A single broken promise could escalate into a silent war, fought not with weapons but with gossip and exclusion. These tensions were magnified because engagements were not simply personal. They represented economic, social, and sometimes political ties. A wealthy family might see a match as a way to secure alliances or maintain status. When it collapsed, the disappointment was not just emotional but financial and strategic. Parents who had invested hope in the match could feel betrayed, blaming the other family for wasting their time and damaging their plans. The most tragic aspect was how little agency women often had in these situations. Many did not choose to end engagements, but were left behind when men withdrew. Sometimes the man's family pressured him to seek a more advantageous match. Sometimes he changed his mind, fearing responsibility or finding interest elsewhere. Whatever the reason, the woman carried the visible scars. Her family might defend her, but the social order placed suspicion on her regardless. It was assumed she had failed in some way, whether through behaviour, modesty, or hidden flaws. There were cases where women ended engagements, but these carried equal or greater risks. To refuse a man after accepting him was seen as ungrateful and dishonourable. Families often pressured women to continue even when they felt unhappy, fearing the shame of withdrawal. Those who resisted were sometimes celebrated privately for courage, but more often they were punished by gossip. Their reputations were marked, making future prospects uncertain. Compared to today, when broken engagements are often treated as personal matters that rarely affect future opportunities, the Victorian response seems extreme, turning private disappointment into public disgrace. It shows again how little freedom individuals had over their relationships. Every choice was judged not only by family but by the wider community, and mistakes were never forgotten. The circulation of rumours made matters worse. Servants, friends, and acquaintances all carried stories, often exaggerating details. A cancelled engagement quickly became a tale of betrayal, dishonesty, or scandal. Even when the truth was simple, financial strain, illness, or incompatibility, the story rarely remained so. Communities thrived on speculation, and each retelling added weight to the judgment against the woman. Once a reputation was damaged, it was nearly impossible to repair. Families attempted to manage these crises with careful strategies. Some announced the end of an engagement with vague explanations, hoping to minimize gossip. Others sent daughters away for a time, presenting the break as her choice or disguising it as illness. A few managed to arrange quick replacements, introducing a new suitor to distract from the scandal. But even with these efforts, the whispers continued. Society had a long memory for disgrace and a short one for truth. Men, by contrast, faced far lighter consequences. A man who ended an engagement might be criticised privately, but he rarely lost standing. Families still considered him a desirable match if his wealth, title, or reputation remained intact. He could move on quickly, proposing to someone else without lasting damage. The imbalance was stark. Women paid with their futures, while men often walked away free. I think the cruelty of this system lies in how it punished women for circumstances they could not control, reducing their lives to the fragile currency of reputation. A woman's worth was tied not to her character but to her appearance of innocence. Once that appearance was cracked, even through no fault of her own, she struggled to recover. Families reminded daughters constantly of the stakes, teaching them to endure and obey in order to avoid disgrace. Looking back, the history of broken engagements reveals how tightly Victorian society bound personal lives to public judgment. Relationships were not private affairs but performances, and failure in that performance carried real consequences. Families treated each engagement as a contract, each cancellation as an insult. Women bore the weight of these tensions, their futures jeopardized by decisions often beyond their control. The curtain of respectability hid much of this turmoil. Outwardly, society appeared orderly, with carefully arranged marriages and polite gatherings. Behind the scenes, however, families argued, alliances fractured, and reputations collapsed. The image of harmony was maintained only by hiding the scars of broken promises. For every marriage celebrated, there were engagements quietly dissolved, each leaving behind anger, suspicion, or regret. In the end, the story of Victorian engagements reminds us that marriage in that era was not simply about love or even companionship. It was about contracts, reputation, and survival within a rigid social system. A broken engagement threatened all three, and so it carried consequences that lasted far beyond the moment itself. And as if these struggles were not enough, even the natural rhythms of a woman's body could interfere with courtship, because society treated her monthly cycle as another reason to judge and restrict her. In the already rigid system of Victorian courtship, even the natural cycle of a woman's body became another obstacle. A young woman was expected to maintain an image of perfect refinement, purity, and control. Any sign that she was a physical being with natural needs or rhythms threatened that image. For this reason, menstruation was treated not only as a private matter, but as something that could disrupt the carefully staged rituals of dating. Families managed it with silence, avoidance, and excuses, ensuring that society's obsession with propriety extended into the most intimate parts of a woman's life. When a woman was on her period, she was usually not allowed to meet potential suitors. The reasoning was not openly discussed, but the assumption was clear. Menstruation was considered unclean, unsuitable for polite company. If a visit was already arranged, families often cancelled it quietly, citing illness or indisposition. This way, the truth remained hidden, but the effect was the same. Courtship had to stop for those days, as though nature itself was incompatible with social rituals. It is almost sarcastic to think that the most normal function of the body could be treated as scandalous, but that was exactly how the Victorians responded. The secrecy surrounding this subject was extreme. Even within families, it was rarely discussed openly. Mothers might prepare their daughters quietly, teaching them how to manage and conceal the signs. Servants sometimes assisted, but they too were expected to maintain silence. If a man ever discovered that a woman had cancelled a meeting for this reason, the danger was not just embarrassment but damage to her reputation. Whispers of uncleanliness could spread, even though nothing improper had occurred. The risk of judgment was so strong that women learned to disguise the truth carefully. The language used reflected this silence. Families rarely mentioned menstruation directly. Instead, they said a girl was unwell or resting. Visitors accepted these explanations, even if they suspected the truth. The goal was to avoid speaking of the subject altogether, preserving the illusion that young women existed without bodily functions. Courtship demanded not only emotional restraint but physical invisibility. The less natural a woman appeared, the more society praised her. This culture of avoidance placed heavy burdens on women. They were expected to manage discomfort without complaint, hiding pain behind calm smiles. If they looked pale or weak, families excused it politely, but women were encouraged not to show it. Silence became a second layer of discipline, reinforcing the lesson that their value lay in appearing perfect, no matter what they endured privately. Men, by contrast, were almost entirely ignorant of these realities. Many grew up with little understanding of menstruation. They were shielded from it by the same culture of silence. As a result, they judged women harshly for behaviours they did not understand. A cancelled meeting, a moment of irritability, or a sign of fatigue could be interpreted as a flaw in character rather than a natural cycle. This ignorance increased the risk of misunderstanding, further isolating women. Compared to today, when open conversations about menstruation are increasingly common and products for managing it are widely available, the Victorian insistence on silence seems like a system designed to erase half of human experience. Women lived with their bodies as though they were secret burdens, never to be mentioned or acknowledged in polite society. The consequences extended beyond courtship. Marriage itself was affected. Many men entered marriage with little knowledge of women's biology. Wives were expected to continue the same patterns of silence, concealing their cycles and managing them privately. Some men reacted with confusion or even disgust if they discovered the truth. The lack of education created distance between spouses, preventing honest communication about something fundamental. For unmarried women, the restrictions could feel even harsher. Imagine being told that a natural cycle disqualified you from receiving guests or participating in normal life. Each month, women had to adjust their schedules around a reality they could never acknowledge. Courtship, already full of obstacles, became even more complicated when biology itself became a source of shame. The constant vigilance created stress, reminding women that even their bodies could betray them in the eyes of society. Mothers often taught daughters strategies to manage these moments. They advised them to keep a careful calendar, to anticipate when they might need to decline invitations, and to prepare polite excuses in advance. Servants, when trusted, played a role in shielding young women from embarrassment. But despite these precautions, accidents could happen. If a young man noticed a change in schedule or overheard whispers, speculation might begin. The threat of gossip was always present, hanging over what should have been a private matter. I think it must have been exhausting to live under such constant pressure, where even the most ordinary fact of life had to be disguised and hidden from view. The silence turned natural rhythms into sources of fear, as though being human was itself a flaw. Instead of acceptance, women received judgment. Instead of care, they received suspicion. The treatment of menstruation in Victorian society reveals once again the larger pattern of control. Courtship was never about honesty. It was about performance. Women were expected to present themselves as pure, delicate, and untouched by the realities of the body. Men were encouraged to believe this illusion, never questioning how it was maintained. The cost of this system was borne entirely by women, who carried pain and secrecy as part of their social duty. Looking back, this approach seems harsh, but it was consistent with the values of the time. Just as emotions were hidden, just as words of love were restrained, so too were bodies silenced. The culture demanded distance from anything natural or uncontrolled. By treating menstruation as shameful, society reinforced its belief that women were valuable only when they appeared untouched by human needs. Yet beneath the silence, women endured. They found ways to protect themselves, to manage their cycles with the limited resources available, and to continue playing their roles. They learned discretion, patience, and resilience, even if it meant sacrificing honesty. In this way, they upheld the system that restricted them, not by choice, but by necessity. Their survival depended on their ability to maintain illusions. In the end, the control of courtship extended even into the body, reminding women that nothing about their lives was free from judgment. Each month brought a new reminder that they were being watched, measured, and restricted. Courtship could be delayed, cancelled, or ruined by something as inevitable as a natural cycle. And while women endured these hidden struggles, society still demanded grand displays of beauty and celebration at weddings. turning the ceremony itself into a spectacle that often concealed the emptiness beneath. Weddings in the Victorian era were some of the grandest spectacles society had to offer. Families poured enormous sums of money into gowns, feasts, flowers, and carriages. The ceremonies were meant to display wealth, tradition, and social standing. The bigger and more elaborate the wedding, the more successful the family appeared to be. But beneath the glitter and ceremony, many of these marriages had little to do with love. They were agreements, arrangements, and performances designed to reassure the world that both families were prosperous and respectable. The happiness of the bride and groom mattered less than the image projected to the guests. For brides, the day was often overwhelming. Many young women entered marriage without deep feelings for their husbands. They may have met only a handful of times before the engagement, always under supervision, and rarely with opportunities for honest conversation. On the wedding day, they were dressed in gowns that symbolized purity and wealth, displayed before hundreds of people as though they were part of a theatre production. The ceremony bound them for life to a man they might not know well, and in some cases, to a man they did not even like. Yet the ritual went on, because society valued appearances above sincerity. It is almost sarcastic to think that the most important day of someone's life was more about showing off to neighbours than about the two people standing at the altar. The details of Victorian weddings highlight the imbalance between appearance and reality. Guests judged the quality of the event not by the closeness of the couple, but by the splendour of the decorations and the size of the gathering. A wealthy family spared no expense, renting large halls or transforming estates into lavish settings. Musicians were hired, tables were filled with food, and gowns were tailored with the finest materials. The point was not to celebrate love, but to confirm status. The more opulent the wedding, the stronger the family's place in society appeared. For the bride, the gown itself carried symbolism that was more public than personal. The popularization of white dresses, inspired in part by Queen Victoria's wedding, reinforced the idea of purity. But purity in this sense was not about her feelings. It was about her reputation, her body, and her value as a wife. Guests admired her beauty, but what they were truly admiring was her family's success in presenting her as desirable and respectable. The wedding was as much about her family's achievement as it was about her future. After the ceremony, receptions provided further opportunities for display. Guests dined, danced, and socialized, commenting on the wealth of the families involved. Every detail became part of the judgment: how fine the silverware was, how elaborate the floral arrangements, how many servants attended. Couples were rarely the focus of these conversations. Instead, the event reinforced networks of influence and demonstrated that both families belonged securely within their social class. The bride and groom played their roles, smiling and performing as required, but their personal connection was often secondary. The reality of married life began only after the festivities ended. For many women, the transition was abrupt and difficult. After weeks of preparation for the wedding, they suddenly found themselves living with someone who was, in truth, a stranger. They were expected to take on responsibilities immediately managing households, pleasing husbands, and bearing children. The romance that modern couples hope to experience is often absent. The marriage was a duty, and the ceremony had been the public contract sealing it. Men, too, experienced this disconnect, though the consequences were not as heavy. They were often more familiar with independence and less pressured to adjust quickly. Some husbands showed kindness, building respect with time. Others treated marriage as ownership, expecting obedience without offering affection. Women had fewer choices in how to respond. Divorce was nearly impossible without scandal, and separation left them socially ruined. The wedding had locked them into a future where duty mattered more than happiness. Compared to today, when weddings are often seen as celebrations of personal love stories, Victorian ceremonies were closer to business transactions disguised as festivals. The families involved celebrated not intimacy but alliances, not affection but contracts. Guests understood this, yet they still participated with enthusiasm, because the spectacle was entertaining and the system rewarded appearances. The emptiness behind the grandeur left many couples disillusioned. Brides who had grown up on novels full of passion discovered that marriage did not match the stories. The rituals of daily life felt heavy, and the absence of real connection made loneliness common. Some women adjusted, convincing themselves that love might grow over time. Others lived quietly, dissatisfied, fulfilling duties without ever experiencing affection. Men sometimes sought fulfillment elsewhere, engaging in affairs or pursuing friendships outside marriage, while their wives endured in silence. The cultural expectation that weddings should be elaborate only deepened this divide. Couples could not admit disappointment without shame, because the wedding itself had been a performance declaring their union perfect. Once the curtains closed on the celebration, they were left with roles to play that did not always match their feelings. The cost of honesty was too high, and so silence became the rule. Families praised the spectacle, ignoring the struggles behind closed doors. I think the saddest truth is that many brides must have stood in their beautiful gowns surrounded by flowers and music, already knowing in their hearts that the life ahead of them would not bring joy. They smiled for guests, thanked their families, and stepped into a carriage beside a man they barely knew, all the while aware that love was not promised. The performance was complete, but the reality was just beginning. Looking back, Victorian weddings reveal the contradictions at the heart of the era. They were moments of joy in appearance but emptiness in meaning. The grandeur masked the absence of love, and the ceremonies highlighted how deeply society valued image over reality. Families competed to outshine one another, while the individuals most affected had little choice in the matter. The glittering surfaces concealed quiet suffering, leaving many couples bound in unions that never offered intimacy. In the end, the lavishness of the wedding served as a symbol of the age itself, disciplined, controlled, and obsessed with propriety, yet hollow beneath the surface. Marriages began not with love but with duty, and the performances of the day only reinforced that truth. And while ceremonies dazzled the public, what followed was even more carefully managed, because lies and disappointments in Victorian marriages were always hidden beneath the banner of family honour. In the final layer of Victorian marriage, truth itself was often hidden under the cover of honour. Families and couples alike understood that appearances mattered more than honesty. A husband and wife could live in quiet misery, but as long as the outside world believed in their happiness, their duty was fulfilled. Public declarations, family announcements, and social conversations repeated the same phrase: they married for love. In reality, many of these marriages contained little affection. The words were not reflections of truth, but shields to protect reputation. It is almost sarcastic to hear those repeated claims of love when everyone around knew that the union was chosen for reasons of duty and status. This culture of concealment shaped daily life. Couples avoided displaying conflict in front of others. Servants were trained not to speak of tensions they witnessed, and family members maintained silence even when they suspected unhappiness. Pain was not shared, it was hidden. Arguments were suppressed, and loneliness was endured quietly. The idea was simple: family honour was too important to be stained by truth. By concealing suffering, households preserved the illusion of stability, even if the individuals inside felt trapped. Wives often carried the heavier share of this silence. A woman unhappy in marriage had no place to turn. Friends might judge her, and even family could insist that she endure. Divorce was nearly impossible without disgrace, and even separation brought scandal. Her duty was to smile, to keep her house in order, and to raise her children. Her emotions were secondary, treated as private weaknesses rather than truths worth acknowledging. Many endured silently, becoming experts in pretending. Their lives became performances, their pain transformed into invisible labour. Husbands, too, sometimes carried disappointments. Some felt burdened by obligations, longing for freedom they could not claim. Others sought comfort in affairs, distractions, or work. But unlike their wives, they were less constrained by judgment. A man's reputation could survive indiscretions more easily than a woman's. Society forgave them more quickly, often looking the other way. This imbalance deepened the silence of marriages, reminding wives that even honesty could not protect them. The stage-like quality of Victorian relationships became obvious in social gatherings. Couples attended parties, dinners, and community events with smiles, laughter, and polite conversation. Guests admired their appearances and congratulated them on their happy union. The truth, often very different, stayed behind closed doors. To admit unhappiness would be to break the script, and breaking the script was never allowed. In this sense, marriage was less a partnership than a role to be played, one that required endless discipline. Compared to today, when couples often speak openly of challenges and even share their struggles with friends, the Victorian insistence on silence seems like living in a theatre where the curtain never falls. The performance continued day and night, and those who broke character faced condemnation. This explains why so many novels of the time explored hidden emotions, forbidden desires, and secret lives. Fiction offered readers what real life denied them: honesty, passion, and truth. Families reinforced the cycle by treating lies as protection. Parents taught children that family honour came first. They repeated lessons about restraint, self-control, and the importance of silence. If a child asked about rumours or noticed tension, they were often told not to speak of it. In this way, deception became part of education, passed down as tradition. The cost was generational, ensuring that each new family repeated the same patterns of concealment. Public announcements of marriages often included words of love, devotion, and happiness. Newspapers printed elegant notices, describing the union as ideal. These words were rarely questioned. Communities accepted them at face value, even when everyone suspected the truth. What mattered was not whether the couple was happy, but whether they appeared to be. Honour functioned like a curtain, hiding pain while projecting beauty. It was a system built on performance, and those inside had no choice but to play along. The end of love in the Victorian era was not a dramatic collapse, but a carefully arranged silence. Even when affection never appeared, couples remained together. Their lives became routines of duty, responsibility, and unspoken disappointment. The system did not value emotional truth, so the lack of it was not considered a failure. Instead, it was seen as normal. Marriage was never expected to be about happiness, only about order. The theatre was prepared long before the vows were spoken, and everyone knew their lines. I think the most striking part is how little room there was for real feeling. How many people must have lived entire lives without ever being able to admit what they truly felt. Their stories remind us that the culture valued image over humanity, performance over intimacy. Behind every smiling couple in a portrait might have been years of silence, regret, or endurance. Their honour was preserved, but their truth was erased. Looking back, the Victorian system of marriage and courtship appears both strict and fragile. Strict, because it demanded endless control. Fragile, because it relied on deception to survive. Without lies, the image of harmony would collapse. Without silence, the illusion of order would fade. This balance created generations of couples living double lives, one for themselves and one for the world. The history of these relationships offers a clear reminder of how much control society can hold over private lives. Love was not free, it was shaped, limited, and often erased by duty. Marriage was not a bond of choice, but a role dictated by family, class, and tradition. Honour became the excuse for every silence, every lie, and every performance. The result was a culture where appearances mattered more than people, and where truth was hidden for the sake of reputation. As we close this long journey through Victorian dating and marriage, the picture that emerges is one of discipline, suppression, and endless performance. Courtship was staged, emotions were restrained, and marriages were bound by silence. The ideals of love, intimacy, and honesty were sacrificed to protect family honor. What we see in the records, the portraits, and the ceremonies is only the surface. The reality beneath was more complicated, often more painful, and rarely acknowledged. And so, when we think of love in the Victorian age, we must remember that it was less a story of passion than a story of performance, less about two hearts and more about two families preserving their image. That concludes the story of what Victorian dating was really like. Thank you for listening patiently through each part of this long narrative. I hope it has given you a clear picture of how tightly controlled relationships once were, and how different our world is today. Have a peaceful night, rest well, and may your dreams be lighter than the stories we have just explored. Good night.